The dawn of amateur radio in the UK and Greece. A personal view. Norman F. Joly. Copyright 1990. London. Joly. 1990. 150 OMP. 0951562800. CONTENTS. 0. Prologue. 1. The development of electricity. 2. The birth of radio communications. 3. What is a radio amateur? 4. The 1921 amateur transatlantic tests. 5. The first Greek radio amateurs. 6. World War I and after in Greece. 7. Pioneers in Greece. 8. Personal reminiscences and anecdotes. 9. Miscellany. 10. Glossary for non-technical readers. Prologue. Thules of Miletus. Thules, who was born in 640 V.C., was a man of exceptional wisdom and one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. He was the father of Greek, and consequently of European philosophy and science. His speculations embraced a wide range of subjects relating to political as well as to celestial matters. One must remember that even up to the 18th century there was no clear distinction between philosophy and science, both being products of the human mind in its attempts to explain reality. Thules had studied astronomy in Egypt, so he was able to draw up accurate tables forecasting when the river Nile would be in flood. But he first became widely known by anticipating an eclipse of the sun for May 585 V.C., which happened to coincide with the final battle of the war between the Lydians and the Persians. He had used some tables drawn up by Babylonian astronomers, but he did not succeed in forecasting the exact day, May 28th, or the hour of the spectacular event. It can well be said that Thules was the first man ever recorded to have cornered the market in a commodity. Having foreseen a 3-year drought, he bought up large quantities of olive oil and stored it for sale at a later date. But who could possibly have imagined that one of Thules' original speculations would affect the radio amateurs of the 20th century? He believed that certain inanimate substances, like lodestones, magnetic rocks, and the resin amber, possessed psyche, a soul. Many centuries had to elapse before this soul was identified as static electricity and magnetism and harnessed for the generation of mains electricity, which dramatically altered the pattern of life on our planet, and also led to the creation of our hobby of amateur radio. About 400 years ago an English scientist called William Gilbert 1544-1603, who had read about the unexplained observation of Thules, also became interested in the intangible property and decided to call it electricity, from the classical Greek word for amber, which is electron. Chapter 1. The development of electricity. The phenomenon which Thules had observed and recorded 5 centuries before the birth of Christ aroused the interest of many scientists through the ages. They made various practical experiments in their efforts to identify the elusive force which Thules had likened to a soul, and which we now know to have been static electricity. Of all forms of energy, electricity is the most baffling and difficult to describe. An electric current cannot be seen. In fact, it does not exist outside the wires and other conductors which carry it. A live wire carrying a current looks exactly the same and weighs exactly the same as it does when it is not carrying a current. An electric current is simply a movement or flow of electrons. Benjamin Franklin, the American statesman and scientist born in Boston in 1706, investigated the nature of thunder and lightning by flying a child's kite during a thunderstorm. He had attached a metal spike to the kite, and at the other end of the string to which the kite was tied he secured a key. As the rain soaked into the string, electricity flowed freely down the string, and Franklin was able to draw large sparks from the key. Of course, this could have been very dangerous. But he had foreseen it and had supported the string through an insulator. He observed that this electricity had the same properties as the static electricity produced by friction. But long before Franklin, many other scientists had carried out research into the nature of electricity. In England, William Gilbert 1544–1603 had noticed that the powers of attraction and repulsion of two non-metallic rods which he had rubbed briskly were similar to those of lodestone and amber. They had acquired the curious quality we call magnetism. Remembering Thales of old, he coined the word electricity. Otto von Guericke 1602–1686, a mayor of Magdeburg in Germany, was an amateur scientist who had constructed all manner of gadgets. One of them was a machine consisting of two glass discs revolving in opposite directions which produced high voltage charges through friction. Ramsden and Wimshurst built improved versions of the machine. A significant breakthrough occurred when Alessandro Volta 1745–1827 in Italy constructed a simple electric cell in 1799, which produced a flow of electrons by chemical means. Two plates, one of copper and the other of zinc, were placed in an acid solution, and a current flowed through an external wire connecting the two plates. Later, he connected cells in series voltaic pile which consisted of alternate layers of zinc and copper discs separated by flannel discs soaked in brine or acid, which produced a higher electric pressure voltage. But Volta never found the right explanation of why his cell was working. He thought the flow of electric current was due to the contact between the two metals, whereas in fact it results from the chemical action of the electrolyte on the zinc plate. However, his discovery proved to be of incalculable value in research, as it enabled scientists to carry out experiments which led to the discoveries of the heating, lighting, chemical and magnetic effects of electricity. One of the many scientists and physicists who took advantage of the current electricity made possible by Volta's cells was Hans Christian Ørsted 1777–1851 of Denmark. Like many others, he was looking for a connection between the age-old study of magnetism and electricity. But now he was able to pass electric currents. His epoch-making discovery, which established for the first time the relationship between magnetism and electricity, was in fact an accident. While lecturing to students, he showed them that the current flowing in a wire held over a magnetic compass needle and at right angles to it, that is east-west, had no effect on the needle. Ørsted suggested to his assistant that he might try holding the wire parallel to the length of the needle north-south. The needle was deflected. He had stumbled upon the electromagnetic effect in the first recorded instance of a wire behaving like a magnet when a current is passed through it. A development of Ørsted's demonstration with the compass needle was used to construct the world's first system of signaling by the use of electricity. In 1837, Charles Wheatstone and William Cooke took out a patent for the world's first 5-needle telegraph, which was installed between Paddington Railway Station in West London and West Drayton Station a few miles away. The 5 copper wires required for this system were embedded in blocks of wood. Electrolysis, the chemical decomposition of a substance into its constituent elements by the action of an electric current, was discovered by the English chemists Carlisle and William Nicholson 1753–1815. If an electric current is passed through water, it is broken down into the two elements of which it is composed, hydrogen and oxygen. The process is used extensively in modern industry for electroplating. Michael Faraday 1791 was responsible for introducing many of the technical terms connected with electrolysis, like electrolyte for the liquid through which the electric current is passed, and anode and cathode for the positive. He also established the laws of the process itself. But most people remember his name in connection with his practical demonstration of electromagnetic induction. In France, André-Marie Ampère 1775–1836 carried out a complete mathematical study of the laws which govern the interaction between wires carrying electric currents. In Germany in 1826, a Bavarian schoolmaster Georg Ohm 1789–1854 had defined the relationship current flow rate and resistance in a circuit Ohm's law, but 16 years had to elapse before he received recognition for his work. Scientists were now convinced that since the flow of an electric current in a wire or a coil of wire caused it to acquire magnetic properties, the opposite might also prove to be true. A magnet could possibly be used to generate a flow of electricity. Michael Faraday had worked on this problem for 10 years when finally, in 1830, he gave his famous lecture in which he demonstrated, for the first time in history, the principle of electromagnetic induction. He had constructed powerful electromagnets consisting of coils of wire, when he caused the magnetic lines of force surrounding one coil to rise and fall by interrupting or varying the flow of current. A similar current was induced in a neighboring coil closely coupled to the first. The colossal importance of Faraday's discovery was that it paved the way for the generation of electricity by mechanical means. However, as can be seen from the drawing, the basic generator produces an alternating flow of current. C. Rotating a coil of wire steadily through a complete revolution in the steady magnetic field between the north and south poles of a magnet results in an electromotive force E. M. F. At its terminals, which rises in value, falls back to zero, reverses in a negative direction, reaches a peak and again returns to zero. This completes one cycle or sine wave. Ohms in SI units. In recent years, other methods have been developed for generating electrical power in relatively small quantities for special applications. Semiconductors, which combine heat insulation with good electrical conduction, are used for thermoelectric generators to power isolated weather stations, artificial satellites, undersea cables, and marker buoys. Specially developed diode valves are used as thermionic generators with an efficiency, at present, of only 20, but the heat taken away from the anode is used to raise steam for conventional power generation. Sir Humphrey Davy 1778 is best remembered for his safety lamp for miners, which cut down the risk of methane gas explosions in mines. It was Davy who first demonstrated that electricity could be used to produce light. He connected two carbon rods to a heavy-duty storage battery. When he touched the tips of the rods together, a very bright white light was produced. As he drew the rods apart, the arc light persisted until the tips had burnt away to the critical gap which extinguished the light. As a researcher and lecturer at the Royal Institution, Davy worked closely with Michael Faraday, who first joined the institution as his manservant and later became his secretary. Davy's crowning honor in the scientific world came in 1820, when he was elected president of the Royal Society. In the U.S., the prolific inventor Thomas Alva Edison 1847–1931, who had invented the incandescent carbon filament bulb, built a number of electricity generators in the vicinity of the Niagara Falls. These used the power of the falling water to drive hydraulic turbines which were coupled to the dynamos. These generators were fitted with a spinning switch or commutator, one of the neatest gadgets Edison ever invented to make the current flow in unidirectional pulses. D.C. in 1876, all electrical equipment was powered by direct current. Today, mains electricity plays a vital part in our everyday lives, and its applications are widespread and staggering in their immensity. But we must not forget that popular demand for this convenient form of power arose only about 100 years ago, mainly for illumination. Recent experiments in superconductivity Using ceramic instead metal conductors have given us an exciting glimpse into what might be achieved for improving efficiency in the distribution of electric power. Historians of the future may well characterize the 20th century as the century of electricity and electronics. But Edison's D.C. generators could not in themselves have achieved the spectacular progress that has been made. All over the world we depend totally on a system of transmitting mains electricity over long distances which was originally created by an amazing inventor whose scientific discoveries changed, and are still changing, the whole world. His name was scarcely known to the general public, especially in Europe, where he was born. Who was this unknown pioneer? Some people reckon that it was this astonishing visionary who invented wireless, remote control, robotics, and a form of X-ray photography using high-frequency radio waves, a patent which he took out in the U.S. In 1890 ultimately led to the design of the humble ignition coil, which energizes billions and billions of spark plugs in all the motor cars of the world. His American patents fill a book 2 inches thick. His name was Nikola Tesla 1856–1943. Nikola Tesla was born in a small village in Croatia which at that time formed part of the great Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today it is a northern province of Yugoslavia, a state created after the 1914–1918 war. Tesla studied at the Graz Technical University and later in Budapest. Early in his studies he had the idea that a way had to be found to run electric motors directly from generators. His professor in Graz had assured him categorically that this was not possible. But young Tesla was not convinced. When he went to Budapest he got a job in the Central Telegraph Office. And one evening in 1882, as he was sitting on a bench in the city park, he had an inspiration which ultimately led to the solution of the problem. Tesla remembered a poem by the German poet Goethe about the sun which supports life on the earth, and when the day is over moves on to give life to the other side of the globe. He picked up a twig and began to scratch a drawing on the soil in front of him. He drew 4 coils arranged symmetrically round the circumference of a circle. In the center he drew a rotor or armature. As each coil in turn was energized it attracted the rotor towards it, and the rotary motion was established. When he constructed the first practical models he used 8, 16, and even more coils. The simple drawing on the ground led to the design of the first induction motor driven directly by electricity. Tesla emigrated to the U.S. in 1884. During the first year he filed no less than 30 patents, mostly in relation to the generation and distribution of mains electricity. He designed and built his polyphase system, which generated 3-phase alternating current at 25. One particular unit delivered 422 amperes at 12.0 volts. The beauty of this system was that the voltage could be stepped down using transformers for local use, or stepped up to many thousands of volts for transmission over long distances through relatively thin conductors. Edison's generating stations were incapable of any such thing. Tesla signed a lucrative contract with the famous railway engineer George Westinghouse, the inventor of the Westinghouse air brake, which is used by most railways all over the world to the present day. Their generating station was put into service in 1895. It supplied power for the Westinghouse network of trains and also for an industrial complex in Buffalo, New York. After 10 years Tesla began to experiment with high frequencies. The Tesla coil, which he had patented in 1890, was capable of raising voltages to unheard of levels such as 300.0 volts. Edison, who was still generating D.C., claimed C was dangerous and to prove it contracted with the government to produce the first electric chair using a C for the execution of murderers condemned to death. When it was first used it was a ghastly flop. The condemned man moaned and groaned and foamed at the mouth. After 4 minutes of repeated application of the C voltage, smoke began to come out of his back. It was obvious that the victim had suffered a horribly drawn-out death. Tesla said he could prove that C was not dangerous. He gave a demonstration of high-voltage electricity flowing harmlessly over his body. But in reality, he cheated because he had used a frequency of 10.0 cycles 10 at extremely low current, and because of the skin effect suffered no harm. One of Tesla's patents related to a system of lighting using glass tubes filled with fluorine, not neon, excited by H.F. voltages. His workshop was lit by this method. Several years before Wilhelm Röntgen demonstrated his system of X-rays, Tesla had been taking photographs of the bones in his hand and his foot from up to 40 feet away using H.F. currents. More astonishing still is the fact that in 1893, 2 years before Marconi demonstrated his system of wireless signaling, Tesla had built a model boat in which he combined power to drive it with radio control and robotics. He put the small boat in a lake in Madison Square Gardens in New York, standing on the shore with a control box. He invited onlookers to suggest movements. He was able to make the boat go forwards and backwards and round in circles. We all know how model cars and aircraft are controlled by radio today. But when Tesla did it a century ago, the motor car had not been invented, and the only method by which man could cover long distances was on horseback. Many people believe that a modification of Tesla's magnifying transmitter was used by the Soviet Union when suddenly one day in October 1976 they produced an amazing noise which blotted out all radio transmissions between 6 and 20s. The woodpecker, V, C, the N, V, C, and most broadcasting and telecommunication organizations of the world complained, but all the Russians would say in reply was that they were carrying out an experiment. At first nobody seemed to know what they were doing because it was obviously not intended as another form of jamming of foreign broadcasts. An old Russian custom, as we all know. It is believed that in the pursuit of his life's ambition to send power through the earth without the use of wires, Tesla had achieved a small measure of success at E.L.F. extremely low frequencies of the order of 7 to 12. These frequencies are at present used by the military for communicating with submarines submerged in the oceans of the world. Tesla's career and private life have remained something of a mystery. He lived alone and shunned public life. He never read any of his papers before academic institutions, though he was friendly with some journalists who wrote sensational stories about him. They said he was terrified of microbes and that, when he ate out at a restaurant, he would ask for a number of clean napkins to wipe the cutlery and the glasses he drank out of. For the last 20 years of his life, until he died during World War I in 1943, he lived the life of a semi-recluse, with a pigeon as his only companion. A disastrous fire had destroyed his workshops and many of his experimental models, and all his papers were lost forever. Tesla had moved to Colorado Springs, where he built his largest ever coil, which was 52 feet in diameter. He studied all the different forms of lightning in his unsuccessful quest for the transmission of power without wires. In Yugoslavia, Tesla is a national hero, and a well-equipped museum in Belgrade contains abundant proof of the genius of this extraordinary man. Chapter 2. The Birth of Radio Communications. By 1850 most of the basic electrical phenomena had been investigated. However, James Clerk Maxwell 1879, professor of experimental physics at Cambridge then, came up with something entirely new. By some elegant mathematics he had shown the probable existence of electromagnetic waves of radiation. But it was 24 years later, 8 years after Maxwell's death, that Heinrich Hertz 1894 in Germany gave a practical demonstration of the accuracy of this theory. He generated and detected electromagnetic waves across the length of his laboratory on a wavelength of approximately 1 meter. His own photograph of the equipment he had set up can be seen in the Deutsches Museum in Munich. To detect the electromagnetic waves Hertz employed a simple form of oscillator, which he termed a resonator. But it was not sensitive enough to detect waves at any great distance. Before wireless telegraphy could become practicable, a more delicate detector was necessary. Credit is due to Eduard Branly 1940 of France for producing the first practical instrument, the coherer. It consisted of two metal cylinders with leads attached, fitted tightly into the interior of a glass tube containing iron or steel filings. The instant an electric discharge of any sort occurred the coherer became conductive, and if it was tapped lightly its conducting property was immediately destroyed. In practice the tapping was done automatically by a tapper which came into action the moment the coherer became conductive. In Russia the physicist Alexander Popov 1859–1905 had used a coherer while engaged in the investigation of the effects of lightning discharges. He suggested that such discharges could possibly be used for signaling over long distances. Old-timers may remember that about 50 years ago Russian amateurs used to send out a card with a drawing of Popov and a caption which claimed that he was the inventor of radio. In Italy, a young 22-year-old electrician became interested in electromagnetic radiation after reading papers by Professor Augusto Righi 1850–1921. It was Guglielmo Marconi 1874–1937, the son of a well-to-do landowner who lived in Bologna, and who was married to Annie Jameson of the well-known Irish whiskey family. Guglielmo, their second son, had his early education at a private school in Bedford, England, and later at Livorno and Florence in Italy. When he read about the experiments of Heinrich Hertz and about Popov's suggestion, he saw the possibility of using these waves as a means of signaling. His first transmitter, shown in the accompanying photograph, did not radiate very far. When he folded the metal plate into a cylinder and placed it on a pole 30 feet above the induction coil and connected to it by a vertical wire, he was able to detect the radiation nearly 2 kilometers away. Marconi realized that his signaling system would be most useful to shipping, and in those days England possessed the world's greatest navy and the world's biggest merchant fleet. The Italian government was not interested in young Marconi's work. So after a family conference he was brought to London by his mother, who had influential relatives there. Not only did they finance his early experiments, but they also put him in touch with the right sort of people. One of these was Allen Campbell Swinton, who became the first president of the Radio Society of London, now the RSGV. Many years later, in 1913, Campbell Swinton introduced the young Italian to William Preece, then engineer-in-chief of the British Post Office. Preece had already been investigating various methods of induction telegraphy. In a book entitled Wireless Telegraphy, published in 1908, William J. White of the Engineer-in-Chief's Department at the G.P.O. wrote, "The work of Sir then Mr. William Preece, important though it was, did not attract the attention of the public to the extent that might have been expected. This was due to the fact that no sooner had he demonstrated a method of wireless telegraphy which was a commercial possibility than his system, and a better one, brought to England by Mr. Guglielmo Marconi in 1896. The possibilities of Mr. Marconi's system were at once recognized by Mr. William Preece. The experience of the elder and the genius of the younger man combined to turn apparently disastrous failures into success. And now in 1908, wireless telegraphy has become, in less than a decade, part and parcel of commercial and national life. The world's first patent for wireless telegraphy was awarded to Marconi on the 2nd June 1896. In it he stated that electrical action can be transmitted through the earth, air, or water by means of oscillations of high frequency. In the first public demonstration of his equipment, Marconi spanned 365 meters between the G.P.O. and Victoria Street. Later, on Salisbury Plain, in March 1897, his signals were detected over 7 kilometers away. On the 11th and 18th May 1897 messages were first exchanged over water. On the 27th of March 1899, during naval manoeuvres, Marconi bridged the English Channel for the first time, a distance of about 140 kilometers. His transatlantic triumph came on the 12th December 1901, when the Morse letter S was transmitted from Poole in Cornwall and received by Marconi himself at St. John's, Newfoundland, who recorded the historic event in his pocket book simply SIGS at 12:20, 1, 10 and 2:20. The operation of Marconi's transmitter was itself. To produce the oscillations he employed the oscillator designed by Augusto Righi. Depressing the key closed the circuit and brought the inductor coil into action. Vivid sparks occurred between the balls of the oscillator, to the accompaniment of a succession of sharp cracks, like the reports of a pistol, and some energy was sent off the square metal plate in the form of trains of electromagnetic waves, which radiated out in all directions. But the energy occupied a very large bandwidth, and the receivers of that period could not separate two transmissions. William J. White of the Post Office wrote in 1908, "The chief objection which has been raised against modern wireless telegraphy is its want of secrecy, with a transmitter sending out waves in all directions. It is possible for unscrupulous persons to receive the messages and make an improper use of them. This form of scientific hooliganism has, in fact, become somewhat notorious. When 2 or 3 transmitters are each sending out their electromagnetic waves, the result, naturally, is utter confusion." White added that the British Postal Administration was refusing to grant licenses for more than one system in the same area, in spite of the fact that there had been some alleged solutions of the problem. The phenomenon of resonance was known, and Drive later Sir Oliver Lodge had taken out various patents between 1889 and 1898 in connection with receivers. Marconi and his assistants ultimately solved the problem by modifying Lodge's Syntonic Leyden jar tuned circuit. They added a tapped inductance in the aerial circuit of the transmitter and used variable capacitors instead of fixed ones. This was probably the most significant modification made in the development of wireless telegraphy. In Greek the word syntonismos, to bring to equal tone, is used for tuning. Apart from the patents taken out by Sir Oliver Lodge and Drive Alexander Muirhead in 1897, patents were taken out in Germany by Professor Braun of Strasbourg, who was joined by Professor Slaby and Count Darko in 1903 to form the Telefunken Company, and in the U.S. By Drive Lee DeForest of the American DeForest Wireless Telegraph Company, who was the first to use a higher C voltage of 20 volts to obtain the necessary high potential discharges, thus dispensing with the induction coil. Again in the U.S. Professor R. O. Fessenden was responsible for the design of new types of transmitting and receiving apparatus. During this period Marconi had resisted all offers by financiers to acquire his patents. In July 1897 he entrusted his cousin Jameson Davis to form the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company Limited, which soon became Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company and ultimately the Marconi Company. William Preece of the Post Office detached one of his assistants, George S. Kemp, to help Marconi. Kemp was destined to become his right-hand man and served Marconi faithfully throughout his life. By today's standards, Marconi can be said to have been a highly successful entrepreneur. He had the great knack of selecting the right man for the job, and inspired deep loyalty in his staff. He regarded himself as an amateur and often paid tribute to the work of radio experimenters. Most of the above passages are quoted from a history of the Marconi Company by W. J. Baker, published by Methuen and Co. Limited, reprinted in 1979. Chapter 3. The Radio Amateur Movement. From the turn of the century enthusiastic young men who built their own items of electrical and wireless apparatus were known as wireless experimenters. Many of them were later granted licenses for the use of wireless telegraphy for experimental purposes in the United Kingdom by the Postmaster General under the terms of the 1904 Wireless Telegraphy Act. In his report to Parliament for the years 1905–1906 the P.M.G. stated that it was his wish to promote experimental investigations in this promising field. In a book published in 1908 by R. P. Howgrave Graham entitled Wireless Telegraphy for Amateurs, the word amateur seems to have been used for the first time. During the 1914–1918 war, all wireless apparatus in the possession of licensed amateurs was closed down under the Defense of the Realm Act of 1914. Experimental transmission licenses numbered 1,600. After the end of the war, an interdepartmental committee was set up, and in its report to the Postmaster General dated April 1919 it stated, "We are of the opinion that the number of stations existing in July 1914 was excessive from the point of view of government control in case of emergency and the necessity of preventing interference with government and commercial working. Further, there was no justification for it from the point of view of the encouragement of research or development of industry. But there was a magnanimous relaxation in the defense regulations when the Post Office notified manufacturers of electrical apparatus that restriction on the sale of buzzers had been removed. Buzzers could now be sold without inquiry as to the use to which the purchaser proposed to put them. During 1919 many issues of Wireless World considered the amateur position, and a leading article in the March issue began with a quotation attributed to Marconi. "I consider that the existence of a body of independent and often enthusiastic amateurs constitutes a valuable asset towards the further development of wireless telegraphy." In a subsequent letter to the editor Marconi wrote, "In my opinion it would be a mistaken policy to introduce legislation to prevent amateurs experimenting with wireless telegraphy which the authorities were contemplating. Had it not been for amateurs, wireless telegraphy as a great world fact might not have existed at all. A great deal of the development and progress of wireless telegraphy is due to the efforts of amateurs." John Ambrose Fleming, the inventor of the diode valve, also wrote to the editor of W. as follows: "It is a matter of common knowledge that a large part of the important inventions in connection with wireless telegraphy have been the work of amateurs in private research, and not the outcome of official brains or the handiwork of military or naval organizations. In fact, we may say that wireless telegraphy itself in its inception was an amateur product. Numerous important inventions such as the crystal detector, the oscillating valve, the tried valve, have been due to private or amateur work. If full opportunities for such non-official research work are not restored, the progress of the art of radio telegraphy and radio telephony will be greatly hindered." Professor W. H. Eccles wrote, "Improvements and invention must be stimulated to the utmost. It is not impossible to devise laws to impose restrictions upon the emission of wireless waves as will preclude interference with the public radio service of the future, RF, I, and T, VI, and yet allow liberal opportunities for the experimental study of wireless telegraphy." Note: the above passages are taken from World at Their Fingertips by John Clarikowitz, O. V. E. 6th, published by the R. S. G. V. in 1968. Chapter 4. The 1921 transatlantic tests most commercial experimental transmissions in wireless telegraphy before World War I were carried out on the long wavelength, though they were not called that at the time. Transmissions by amateurs in the United Kingdom and the U.S.A., on the other hand, were made around 200 meters 1.5 ohms. In the U.S.A., amateurs were permitted to use a D.C. input of 1.0 watts to the anode of the final stage of their transmitters. In the U.K., the maximum power allowed was 10 watts, and the combined height and length of the transmitting aerial was not to exceed 100 feet. So when the first attempt to span the Atlantic was made in February of 1921, it was natural that the American stations should do the transmitting and the Europeans the listening. About 25 U.S. amateur stations participated in the tests, which took place early in the morning on the 2nd, 4th, and 6th of February 1921. Although about 200 European stations had indicated their intention to listen, only 30 actually submitted logs, and not a single one of them was able to report hearing anything that could be attributed to the American transmissions. The then editor of X wrote, "We have tested most of the circuits used by the Britishers and find them one and all decidedly inferior to our standard American regenerative circuit using variometer tuning in secondary and tertiary circuits. We would bet our new spring hat that if a good U.S. amateur with such a set and an Armstrong superheterodyne could be sent to England, reception of the U.S. transmissions would straightway become commonplace." Strong language. In September of the same year it was announced that a prominent U.S. amateur, Paul Godley Twose, would be going to Europe to take part in the second series of tests planned for December. His expenses were being paid by the A.R.R.L., which already boasted having 15 transmitting members. In the U.S.A., distances of over 2 miles had already been achieved. During his brief stay of a few hours in London, Paul Godley was introduced to Senator Marconi, to Admiral of the Fleet Sir Henry Jackson, to Alana Campbell Swinton, and many other distinguished members of the Wireless Society of London, as the Hey. 'Hey, hey, 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 SG.V. was then called. Paul Godley first set up his receiving equipment at Wembley Park, Middlesex, but soon decided that the electrical noises in the area would not permit reception of the weak transatlantic signals. He therefore obtained permission to set up the European receiving station at Ordrison, a coast town near Glasgow, Scotland. The actual site was a large field heavily covered with seaweed. He was assisted in the erection of his receiving antenna by a member of the Marconi International Marine Communications Company. 1. 300 feet of phosphor bronze wire was stretched 12 feet above the ground on 10 poles spaced equally along the full length of the wire, which was earthed at the far end through a non-inductive resistor. This was the first beverage-type receiving array ever erected in the United Kingdom. Before the actual tests took place, the length of the wire was reduced to 850 feet. At 0:50 on December 9, 1921, Godley identified signals from Audiobook located at Greenwich, Connecticut. The station there was manned by 6 members of the Radio Club of America. One of the operators was E. Howard Armstrong, inventor of the regenerative detector, super regeneration, and the supersonic heterodyne receiver, though the French claim that the Superit was first designed by Lucien Levy of Paris. 2 days later, the historic first complete message transmitted by U.S. amateurs and received in Europe on the short waves, actually 230 meters, heralded a new era. The message read: "No one to Audiobook. Words 12. New York, December 11, 1921. To Paul Godley, Ordrison, Scotland. Hearty congratulations. Signed Burghard, Inman, Grinan, Armstrong, Amy Cronkite." 8 British amateurs had also copied the message correctly. One of them was W. E. Bill Corsham, 12 of Willesden, London, who was later credited by the R. S. G. V. and then the R. R.L. as being the inventor of the XL card. Bill had used a simple 3-valve receiver and an inverted L wire 1 feet long compared to Godley's huge beverage array. In the summer of 1922, amateurs in France began to get licenses, and Leon Deloy, president of the Radio Club of Nice in southern France, started hearing British stations. After a visit to the U.S., Deloy was able to improve his equipment, and on November 27, 1923, he contacted Fred Schnell Onimo of West Hartford, Connecticut, for the first ever 2-way XO across the Atlantic. They used the useless wavelengths around 100 meters. Internationals had come to stay. Chapter 5. The first Greek radio amateurs. As no licenses were issued for many years, there are no official records to be consulted. Early activity was mainly in and around Athens, but there may have been 1 or 2 stations in other parts of the country which we never heard in the capital. At the time of writing 1987, 4 of the original pioneers in the Athens area are alive, and 3 of them are currently active on the H.F. bands. Athanasius Takis Kalmias has XL cards addressed to him dated 1929, when he was a shortwave listener in Odessa, Russia, with the Sol. Kalzign Rook 1136. In 1931 his family, like many other Greek families in Russia, moved to Athens, where Takis built a 4-valve transmitter with which he was very active on 40 and 20 meter, using the Kalzign Svony. I frequently operated his station myself, and when I asked him why he had chosen that particular Kalzign, he gave me what proved to be a truly prophetic answer. It will be ages," he said, "before the Greek state officially recognizes the very existence of radio amateurs and begins to issue transmitting licenses to them. After that it might take another 50 years for them to get to the three-letter series beginning with Svoni." In actual fact, this is what happened. Legislation was enacted 40 years later, and the Khalzin Svoni was officially allocated to Nikita Venizelos after 54 years had elapsed, although at the time there was no official recognition of amateur radio in Greece. The existence and identity of the handful of undercover operators was known to the head of the section at the Ministry of Posts and Telegraph's Greek initials T. Stefanos Eleftherio, who did more than anyone else to encourage and promote the development of our hobby. In fact, following a minor brush with the police in 1937 described by Ntodo later in this book, Eleftherio issued 3 licenses for experimental research in connection with the propagation of short waves on the basis of earlier legislation governing the use of wireless telegraphy, which really had nothing to do with amateur radio. The recipients of these 3 licenses were Kostas Bill Tavaniotis Svonek, Agis Kazizis Svonika, and Nikis Katsalis Svonik. As there were no relevant regulations, the choice of Khalzin was left to the individual operators. For instance, Tavaniotis ran his own electrical and electronic business called Kunstov Electric, so he decided to use as his Khalzin. As far as I know, the following 10 amateurs were active in the Athens area in 1937. 1. Takis Kambias, Svoni 2. Bill Tavaniotis, Svonek silent key 3. Polycarpos Psomiadis, Svonas now, Twodo. 4. Agis Kazizes, Sponica silent key 5. Nikis Katsalis, Svonink silent key 6. George Zarifis, Svonis 6 now, Svoni. 7. Nassos Koukolis, Svons silent key 8. George Yipapas, Svanaji now. Kurt. 9. Menelaus Paiduses, Svonum 10. Norman Joly, Svoners now. 3. In 1952, Kostas Karagianis, who ran a big business called Radio, Karagiani published an amazingly comprehensive book entitled Elleniki Radiophonia, which means Greek broadcasting. It contained a vast treasure of information on many subjects allied to broadcasting, and there was a page entitled Don 1940 which dealt with amateur radio activity in Greece before World War I. It confirmed most of the names listed above, as can be seen in the photocopy of the original Greek text, and it mentioned 3 others: George Gerardo's Svoni, silent key S. Stefanou and Mike Psalidas, who was allocated the Khalzin Svonov 20 years later, though he, like many others, had come on the air after the end of the war with an unofficial Khalzin. Were all these operators, who functioned strictly in accordance with international regulations, pirates? In my view, they were certainly not pirates. If the state was officially unaware of the existence of amateur radio, how could they apply for licenses and be issued with official cautions? Later in this book, Ntodo describes how a handful of amateurs had prepared draft legislation in 1937 at the request of Stefanos Eleftherio of the ministry, but the outbreak of World War I in September 1939 had prevented him from taking any action in this connection. The island of Crete in southern Greece was first heard on the air in 1938 when George Zarifis came on 40-meter, using the Khalzin's 6. His transmitter consisted of a single metal 6 crystal oscillator with an input of about 7 watts. For reception he used an American case broadcast receiver in which he had fitted a faux. In a very short period he had about 500 XOs. 44 years later, some of the younger generation of operators who had not heard of this early activity from Crete allocated the prefix S9 to the island. Rather illogically they allocated Spite to all the other islands irrespective of their geographical position, and with yet another exception. Spy for the 12 Dodecan's Islands. General George Zarifis, retired Spony as he is now, had started playing with wireless a long time before he went to Crete. In 1921, when he was in the fourth form at school, he had bought 2 kits of parts from France and put them together with the help of his fellow student George Grabinger. The kit consisted of a bright emitter tried in an oscillating circuit. The heater supply was a 4-volt accumulator, and a dozen or so dry cells, with an earphone in series, supplied the anode voltage. The tuned circuit consisted of a coil with a small pressure-operated capacitor across it. A carbon microphone with a dry cell in series was connected to 2 or 3 turns of wire wound over the coil. The assembled kits were tested close to each other, and they were. Later, when they had connected random length wire antennas to the circuits, the 2 schoolboys were able to talk to each other across the 400 meters which separated their homes. These contacts quite definitely heralded the dawn of amateur radio in Greece at about the same time as the 1921 transatlantic tests were taking place. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler's armies invaded Poland. Great Britain, which had a treaty with Poland, was compelled to declare war on Germany 2 days later, on the 3rd, followed by France. Canada and Australia declared war on Germany the next day. All the radio amateurs in Athens immediately dismantled their transmitters and dispersed the components. So ended the first phase of amateur radio activity in Greece. Chapter 6. World War I and After in Greece. Socrates Kautraubis Spony described to me how his interest in radio was aroused in 1935 when he was 13 years old. His father had decided to buy a domestic radio receiver. Of course, in 1935 Athens had no broadcasting service. Socrates said, so the receiver had to be able to tune into the short-wave broadcasting bands. As we already had a Westinghouse refrigerator, my father decided we should try one of their receivers. When I say try, I must explain that it was the usual thing to ask a number of agents to submit their latest models for comparison at one's home. I remember that together with the Westinghouse, we had an Atwater Kent, Philco, Arca, Stromberg Carlson, and several sets of European manufacturers such as Philips, Blaupunkt, Saba, etc. We finally settled for the German Saba because it was the prettiest and blended better with our living room furniture. There were very few stations to be found on the short waves, but I remember the Dutch station run by the Philips Company in Eindhoven. The announcer was Edward Starts, who spoke perfect English and about a dozen other languages. This is the happy station. Broadcasting from the Netherlands, he would say cheerfully. A couple of years after we had bought the radio, we were returning from an open-air movie round about midnight when I noticed a book on sale at a roadside kiosk. It was entitled The Radio Amateurs Handbook, published by the L.R.R.L. I had no idea what the initials stood for. The price was astronomical for my pocket, but after a little coercion I got my father to buy it for me. When I began to read it, I discovered the existence of radio amateurs. It was the 1939 edition, and I found a circuit for a receiver which looked simple enough for me to try. It was described as a regenerative detector and audio amplifier. At that time, the best place to buy components in Athens was at a store called Radio Karasiany. But 3 other shops also stocked valves, tubes, and components. One was the Electron, run by George Spanos, who was the agent for the Dutch Philips Company. Then there was a shop in a basement next door, Kunststof Electric, owned by Bill Tavaniotis Sponek. A wide range of components were also stocked by the Raytheon agent, Nick Katselis, Sponek. I obtained some plug-in forms and wound the coils carefully according to the instructions, but unfortunately the receiver didn't work very well, if at all. When I asked a few friends, they suggested I should shorten the very long wires I had used between the components. And sure enough, I had the greatest thrill of my life when for the first time I heard Rome on short waves on my very own homemade receiver. Outstanding stations in the broadcast band in those days were Trieste in northern Italy, Katowice in Poland, Breslau in Germany, and Toulouse in southwest France. Although I had read about the activities of radio amateurs in the handbook, I had not yet heard any of the half dozen or so stations that were already operating on and telephony in the Athens area. My father used to buy the periodical London Calling, which contained the overseas programs of the V.C., as well as the programs of the principal European broadcasting stations. This publication also carried advertisements, and it was there that I first saw an illustration of the Hammerlund Super Pro and realized that there were receivers specially designed for the reception of short waves. But during the German-Italian occupation of Greece between 1941 and 1944, my little homemade receiver played a vital role in enabling us to listen secretly to the V.C. broadcasts, because the authorities had sealed all radios to the broadcast medium wave band and to the frequency of Radio Athens. Most people devised ingenious methods of listening to stations other than Athens. After the end of the war, a friend of mine who returned to Athens from Cairo brought me the 1945 edition of the R.R.L. handbook, which is still on the shelf, as you can see. Socrates explained that in 1945 there was complete political upheaval in Greece, owing to the events that had taken place during the foreign occupation. So the general election of that year was carried out under the supervision of foreign observers from the U.S., the United Kingdom, and France. The Russians did not send a mission. Owing to my knowledge of English, I was employed by the American mission to act as interpreter. One day, when I was off duty, I was taken by a friend to a signals unit where there were many pieces of equipment which had been liberated, and I was able to buy a 342 receiver. Later, when Harry Barnett's phone, who was in the press department of the British Embassy, returned to England, I bought his Hallicrafter. 28. It was at Harry's house in Kolonaki that I had my first taste of amateur radio in action. He had a National Pro for reception, and he had constructed a 50-watt transmitter using surplus components which were in plentiful supply at that time. Another friend of mine, Jim Liverios, was employed at the Civil Aviation Transmitter site on a hill south of Nice, Smyrny. The American mission had set up their shortwave transmitters on the same site, and later Interpol installed their own equipment as well. Liverios was always on night shift because he attended the university during the day. I still don't know how he ever managed to get any sleep. When things were quiet, he would borrow a 5 transmitter and tune it in the 20-meter band. Using a Calzign of his own choice, probably a different one, every night he would have contacts with the whole world. On his invitation, I went there at midnight one night and stayed until the morning. I remember we had XOs with Cuba, Chile, New Zealand, and Australia. The affair of the Piraeus police. In 1947, there was a war in northern Greece, which some people called a civil war and others a war against the guerrillas, depending on whose side they were on. Suddenly one morning all the Athens newspapers came out with some amazing headlines. The wireless transmitters of the communists have been seized in Athens. Wireless transmitters found in communist hands. How the 5 transmitters of the communists were discovered. The 6 installations seized by the police. Two of the newspapers printed the identical photograph included in the montage with the following caption: "The communist transmitters seized by the Piraeus police." This was a photograph of the shack of Mike's Psalidas Sponov. At the top right one can see a 2-inch homemade monitor oscilloscope, which the newspapers described as a powerful radar. "During the last 3 days," wrote one newspaper, "the police in Piraeus have been investigating a very serious case implicating leading cadres of the Communist Party. Of course, it was nothing of the sort. The equipment they had seized belonged to 5 radio amateurs: George Gerardo's Spony, Mike's Psalidas Sponov, Nasso's Kukolis Sponik, Agis Kazizis Slonica, and Sotiris Stefanou, who didn't have a Kalzin yet. In fact, Mike's Psalidas was not even at home at the time of the police raid, as he was in a military camp in the outskirts of Athens, doing his compulsory military service." The newspapers described in detail what had been found. At the house of Mike's Psalidas, who was a student at the Athens Polytechnic, the police found wireless telegraphy receiving equipment, a national pro, wireless telephony equipment in full working order, that is, 2 transmitting microphones, a step-down transformer, and various other items. The same newspaper went on, unfortunately, at the house of Agis Kazizis, at 25 Tendau Street, the search was inconclusive because a certain person, well known to the police, and whose arrest is imminent, removed a high-power transmitter just before the police arrived and disappeared with it. Another newspaper referred to telegrams in code, received from abroad and from the secret headquarters of the Communists, which are now being deciphered by a special department. These were Sponog's little collection of XL cards. Stefanos Eleftherio of the ministry immediately took up the matter. Firstly, he pointed out to the Piraeus police that Athens did not come under their jurisdiction, and they had no right to arrest anybody there without a warrant. Secondly, all the 5 radio amateurs they had arrested were known for their nationalistic political convictions, particularly Psalidas, whose father was a senior officer of the Royal Hellenic Air Force. Before the suspects were released and their confiscated equipment returned to them, they were warned not to speak to newspaper reporters at the risk of getting a kick up their backsides. This was to prevent the public from learning how ludicrous had been the accusations, and how completely unjustified the arrests had been. But one newspaper came out the following day with a banner headline: "The owners of the wireless and radar equipment all turned out to be staunch royalists." This paper sent a reporter to interview Svonik. They wrote, in reply to a question from our reporter, "Mr. Kukolis said that when the police realized the foolishness of their action, they issued a summons against him under Law 4749, which has absolutely nothing to do with amateur radio. During the 10 years following the end of World War I there were about 15 to 20 very active amateurs in the Athens area, all using calcions of their own choice because no government legislation had yet been enacted. Most of these operators subsequently obtained licenses and had to change to the official series. I remember 2 ills who were very popular in Europe and the U.S. Because they spoke several languages fluently, but they never reappeared when licenses began to be issued. Since 1945 the U.S. and British signals units were authorized by the Greek Ministry of Communications to issue calls to military and diplomatic personnel in the series 0 in the case of American staff and 0 for the British. Socrates continued, "I heard that the Americans had formed a club called Attica Amateur Radio Club in Kifisia, a suburb to the north of Athens, and in due course I was able to become a member, in 1954. Socrates continued, "George Zarifis currently, Spony, who was a regular army officer in the legal branch, approached Mr. Nicholas, who was director of the wireless division at the Ministry of Communications, and asked him, "Since you have authorized the Americans and the British to issue licenses, why do you not grant the same facility to us Greek amateurs?" To which Nicholas had replied, "There is no law of the land recognizing the very existence of radio amateurs, so how can I issue licenses to you?" It was then that we decided to form an association whose principal objective would be the enactment of legislation recognizing officially the existence of radio amateurs in Greece. As a recognized body, we would then be able to go back to Nicholas and get him to pursue the matter. That was how, late in 1957, we formed the Radio Amateur Association of Greece. R. G. Greek initials E. R. At the same time, after considerable effort, we got the ministry to issue 7 licenses based on the Wireless Telegraphy Act of 1930 No. 4797 and the regulations relating to Law 1049 of 1949, as well as a document dated July 8, 1957, issued by the Radio Division of the Central Intelligence Service, Greek initials K. Y. P. R. This order authorized the installation of a 50-watt transmitter to an applicant under certain strict limitations, one of which was that the station could only be operated from 6:00 to 8:00 hours and from 13:00 to midnight. The 7 lucky recipients are shown in the accompanying photograph. Akis Leonos Sponid, Socrates Kautraubis Sponi, Nassos Koukolis Sponik Silent Key, George Zarifis Sponi, Mike Psalidas Sponov, George Vernerdakis Sponov, and George Gerardos Sponi Silent Key. At that time, 1958 Mayim station consisted of a Hammerlund 600 receiver and a home-built transmitter using an Italian Geloso faux exciter driving a pair of 6146 in the final, with anode and screen modulation by a pair of 807s in class Abtuo. I had also assembled a double conversion receiver using a Geloso front end. This was typical of the equipment used in Greece and Italy in the early 1960s. Licenses continued to be issued until 1967, when the junta colonels Papadopoulos and Patakis established the military dictatorship. We were all ordered to seal our equipment and obtain written confirmation from the nearest police authority that the disablement had been carried out. 6 months later, in December of 1967, we started getting our licenses back. Most of us believed that because some of the younger officers in the military government had received training at the Pentagon in the U.S., they convinced their superiors that it was better for the genuine amateurs to be allowed to operate their equipment under close supervision by the military and under new regulations, rather than have undercover operators starting up all over again. George Gerardos Sponi had a friend, Oresti Yika, who was involved in government telecommunications, and it was through him that draft legislation for the issue of amateur licenses was instigated, but not for the first time. Unsuccessful attempts had been made before the war. In 1965, when George Papandreou was Prime Minister, on the very day when the draft bill was going to be put before Parliament, the government resigned, and another 10 years went by. When legislation was finally published in the Government Gazette in 1972, owing to the prevailing political situation, military dictatorship, it had serious limitations imposed by some ministries which had to look after their own interests, especially the Ministry of National Defense. But George Gerardos Sponi, who had been closely involved, decided that it would be better to overlook certain details which may seem strange to us at the present time, details which could be rectified at a later date, provided the law was finally on the statute book. For instance, I refer to the very restricted frequencies we were allocated in the 80-meter band, 3, 500 to 3, 600 ms. Obviously, when we began transmitting telephony below 3,600, we were greeted with angry protestations from the operators there. And what was worse, the voices of Greek amateurs were not heard in this portion of the phone allocation from 3,750 to 3,800. Unfortunately, there was another and more serious snag. The last paragraph of the law said that it would come into force only after publication in the Government Gazette of Regulations clarifying certain details and procedures. So we were back to square one. But this did not prevent the general staff of the military dictatorship. When the dictatorship came to an end, the new government finally published Regulation 271 on April 30th, 1976, which made the 1972 law fully operative. During the period of the military dictatorship, a breakaway club was formed by Dinos Psaloyianis, who added the word national to its name, making the Greek initials E.R. His motives were rather dubious, one of them being that he objected to a regulation which required an applicant for a license to produce a declaration signed by the President and the Secretary of Radio Amateur Association of Greece. Psaloyianis, who had contacts with the military authorities, both his father and brother were officers, declared, "I will form my own association and issue declarations myself." By this maneuver he obtained licenses for quite a few newcomers. But after a year or two his club ceased to function, and most, if not all, of its members joined the R.A.G. An amendment of Law 1244 of 1972 published in the Government Gazette No. 114 dated June 3, 1988 finally abolished the requirement of the controversial declaration, as well as the rule which said that before anyone could apply for a license they had to join an officially recognized association or club. Chapter 7. Pioneers in Greece. 1. General George Zarifis retired. Svoni. As recorded in detail in Chapter 5. George was undoubtedly the first Greek amateur to have two-way contacts using radio telephony, way back in 1921. He was also the first amateur to operate from the island of Crete in 1938. 2. Drive Costas Fimarellis phoned. Transequatorial propagation. On October 9, 1988 at 23:10, the new world distance record was established on the 15s band by the Greek experimental station Stwad, operated by Kostas Fimarellis and a station in Tokyo, when it was proved that the signals had traveled a distance of 650 over the South American continent. This is 15.0 kilometers more than the short path between the two stations, over which there was absolutely no propagation at that moment in time. A simple 5-element Yagi and a power of 100 watts was used at Stwad. The contact was on, but the signals were so strong that it might well have been on. It is estimated that 8 hops were needed to cover this record distance. Most people know by now that Svond was one of the principal stations involved in the very successful transequatorial propagation tests which took place during the 21st sunspot cycle between 1977 and 1983. Costas gave me a simplified explanation of the phenomenon first noticed by Ray Cracknell Zetwaj and Roland Whiting 5-4 way back in September 1957, namely, that signals can travel great distances across the equator 5.0 to 8.0 kilometers during the years of high sunspot activity. Costas said that usually stations located approximately the same distance north and south of the magnetic not geographic equator can contact each other shortly after sunset at both. The first such took place on the 10th April 1978 between Zetwaj and 5-4. 2 days later Zetwaj contacted George Vernadakis Svonub, and this contact, was followed a few days later with XOs with Svond and Svanix. Fuller details of these contacts are given later in this book in the interview with Svoneb. In October 1976, there was a rumor that 145 signals had been heard directly between Argentina and Venezuela. With the imminent beginning of Sunspot Cycle 21, many amateurs in the northern and southern hemispheres began organizing tests on 50, 144, 220, and 430 tubes. Within less than a year, successful two-way contact was established between Argentina and Venezuela on 140 forms. Greece is favorably placed for tip to countries in Africa where there is considerable amateur radio activity, like Zimbabwe and the Union of South Africa. So towards the end of 1977, Svoneb and Svond began looking for colleagues in suitable geographic locations with the appropriate equipment and the time and inclination to engage in tests which could go on for months and months on end. Very soon the following stations agreed to participate in the tests. The northern group included Svoneb, Svond, 5 Fora and 5 Foras. In the southern hemisphere participants were Zetwaj, now Twohu, Sixpel, Sixten, Sixln and Strib, after 4 months of daily test schedules. Early in 1978, successful contacts took place on 140 forms, some of which constituted world distance records for that time, as can be seen in the accompanying table. Amateurs in Malta, Italy, France, and Spain soon began to participate in the tests, as well as amateurs in other areas of South Africa. It can be seen from the world map that the magnetic dip shown as a heavy line is very different to the geographic equator. The P of Svoneb is in a suburb 10 kilometers north of Svonds, so George's contacts with the stations in Africa always had that edge on them. In South Africa, Dave Larsen Sixten had set up a beacon which was first heard in Athens by Svoneb in February 1979. Within a few days Sixten had XOs with Svond and Svoneb. The latter contact was a world distance record via the F regions of the ionosphere because of the extra distance involved owing to the locations of the two Greek stations. As mentioned in the previous paragraph, for anyone who may be interested, very comprehensive reports of the work done in transequatorial propagation during Cycle 21 and earlier appeared in articles written by Ray Cracknell, Zetwaj Twohu, and Roland Whiting 5 for Frio in the June-July-August 1980 issues of Radio Communication, the Journal of the R. S. G. V. and in the November-December 1980 issues of Record Transequatorial Propagation Contacts. During Sunspot Cycle 21 stations date IFV6 Lunda 145, 9/20/1977 2, 05, 0 world record distance on 140 forms. First Western Hemisphere contact. 6 Kite 144, 1 Tintwa 11, 55. 61st Pacific Area contact. Faro Lufivdes 145, 112 Etwa 0, 12.6. 340 new world distance record on 140 forms. Ifivez Luthri at 432, 113 Twa 1, 10.5. 101st reception of 432 signals in Western Hemisphere. 5-4 Zetwaj 144, 110 17, 45, 801st T. P. Contact between Europe and Africa. Svoneb Zetwaj 144, 112E47818, 06. 261st Greek distance record on 140 forms. Sphoned 6 144. 113 918. 15.7. 120 New World distance record on 140 forms. Sphoned Zetwaj 432. 323 7918. 26. 251st. Reception of 432 signals between Europe and Africa. Aforits 3 144. 130 Onethri 7918. 57. 890 world distance record reception on 140 forms. 3. George Vernadakis. Svonob. V.H. F. In March 1988 I visited George Vernadakis Svonob, formerly Phoenician of Marseilles, France, who spoke to me about his contribution to the transequatorial tests and his other experiments in connection with moon bounce, meteor scatter, and sporadic e-propagation. In 1965 George told me I was the only station equipped for contacts via meteor scatter, so it was easy for me to make contacts with many European stations. The longest distance I achieved was with Yuanes, a physics professor at the University of Leningrad in the Soviet Union. Norman, forgive me for interrupting you, but please explain in simple terms what you mean by meteor scatter. George. Meteor scatter is a way of making contacts on 2 meters by reflection from meteorites, shooting stars as they are called colloquially, which we see on clear nights during the summer. Of course, they are not falling stars at all. They are meteorites which burn up when they hit the Earth's atmosphere, leaving the trail that we see. We take advantage of this phenomenon for bouncing our signals off the trail, but unfortunately it is a very short-lived event. Once, when there were a lot of meteorites, I was able to maintain contact with Xenezi of Luxembourg for a whole 3 minutes on SP. It was during the period of the Perseids, which usually occur for a week in August, when the Earth's orbit takes it through this cloud of space debris. Millions of meteorites can be as small as a grain of sand and of course leave no visible trail when they strike the Earth's atmosphere. The Earth goes through other major clusters in April and in December. The phenomenon can also affect signals on lower frequencies. One can be in XO on 20 meters via ground wave with a station a couple of 100 miles away with signals around STO to S3. Suddenly 1 or 2 words are heard at S9, which indicates a momentary reflection off a meteorite trail. George also explained that in order to defeat the brevity of the time when communication was possible, it was customary to record a message on a tape recorder and transmit it at high speed. The other station would also record at high speed and then play back at normal speed to hear the message normally. I asked Svonob to tell me about sporadic e-propagation. In this form of contact, the signals are reflected from an ionist area 90 to 120 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. I have been having contacts by this method for about 18 years now, even before the advent of SPON 2 meters. I have had contacts with England and with Moscow to the northeast of Athens. The phenomenon occurs for 3 or 4 months during the summer, and never during the winter. The ionization moves very rapidly sometimes. You may be talking to a station in Malta, and he suddenly disappears, and a station in Yugoslavia comes up on the same frequency. Every summer, George continued, we get troposcatter, which allows communication on all frequencies from to 10s even. This type of propagation occurs during certain special meteorological conditions, like high barometric pressure and extreme heat. We sometimes hear stations in Malta and Sicily with very loud signals. In 1966 I built an aerial array consisting of 8-9 element Yagis for 2 meters with the axis of rotation pointing to the North Star, enabling me to track the moon automatically. I was hoping to make some moon bounce contacts, but at that time it was very difficult to construct low noise preamplifiers. After many days and hours of trying, I managed a single brief contact with Phyto in France. Some time later I heard that Mike Stalk-Sixmick had heard me in California. The funny thing about this aerial array was that it enabled me to receive television signals from Nigeria on Channel 3, but only when I raised it up to an elevation of nearly 90 degrees. Norman, I understand that Kostas Georgios is the only Greek amateur who has had successful XOS via moonbounce. George. Yes, indeed. But it was many years later, using a low-noise gas-fit preamplifier. Combs in the U.S. Has an array consisting of 48 yages, which enable him to contact stations with more modest installations. In 1970, a technician from Stanford University came to Athens because the tracking station they had set up on Mount Pendley could not pick the Universitas satellite, whereas they were getting good signals from it in Spain. One of the assistants at the station told the American that he knew an amateur who could pick up signals from satellites. Meaning me? The American, who happened to be an amateur himself, immediately asked to see me. When he saw my 8-antenna array, he suggested we should use it to try and pick up the university satellite. I pointed out to him that my array was for 140 forms, whereas the satellite beacon was transmitting on 136 He gave me the coordinates for the next pass, and I rotated and raised my array in anticipation. When the exact time arrived, my modest receiver picked up the satellite beacon loud and clear. The American got so excited he asked me if he could use my telephone to call the university in the U.S. He told them the satellite had been heard at last in Athens, and by an amateur no less. Later I received a letter from NASA, thanking me for the assistance I had given. When the American left, he gave me that 15's converter you can see there on the shelf. Norman, tell me about your contribution to the transequatorial tests of 1979. Svonab. I had been in regular contact with Sixln on 10 meters long before Kostas Svond appeared on the scene. I remember asking Sixln why we should not receive South African stations on 2 meters when we could hear them so well on 15's. He had replied that the two frequencies behaved in a very different manner, but there was no harm in trying. He got Sixpo and Sixten interested in the idea, particularly Sixten, who had much better aerials and a very good. He was the one who stood the better chance of being heard in Greece. We arranged a schedule of transmitting and listening every evening. First they transmitted and we listened, and then we transmitted and they listened, and contact was maintained on 10 meters. Norman, you said every evening. Do you mean that the sun has something to do with this type of propagation? George, most certainly. All the contacts that were made subsequently were at least 1 hour after the relevant part of the ionosphere was in darkness. George then described how the first signals were heard via transequatorial propagation. George, first we heard the beacon on 144. 116 set up by Ray Cracknell Zetwaj in southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. The date was April 12, 1978 at 18:0 GMT. 10 months later, I heard Sixten's automatic beacon with a colossal signal, but he was not at home. I went to 20 meters and put out a frantic for any station in South Africa, but got no reply. I returned to the cross-band frequency on 10 meters, which we used regularly for 20-15 XOs, and managed to contact a station in South Africa, who was very far away from Sixten, but who kindly offered to XP a message by telephone. He was told that Sixten had gone out but would be back soon. I was terrified that the opening would not last long enough, but in a few minutes I heard him calling me slowly "Aunt," and we exchanged reports at 17:20 GMT on February 16, 1979. This was a new world record for the longest distance on 2 meters. 3 days earlier, however, When I was not at home, Costas, Svond, had established the first tip contact between Greece and South Africa when he contacted Sixten. As you know, my location is a mere 10 kilometers north of Svond's. I have a tape recording of Myksa with Sixten as well as with Sixpu, whose signals came through a few minutes later at 17:34 GMT on that historic evening. The local time in Athens was 7:34 p.m. Of course, the distance record was broken again on September 17th, 1981, when I contacted Sforbo, who is 110 kilometers further south than Sixten. Norman, were all these contacts only on the key? George: yes, all the contacts were on K. On several occasions we tried Sp, but there was so much distortion that not a single word could be identified. Tip has a lot of flutter and fading, and, as you can hear on the tapes, even the Morse comes through like a breathing noise. Not a clear tone. This applies to contacts between Greece and South Africa. Contacts between Japan and Australia, where the distances involved are smaller, have been made on Sp. Norman: what about cycle 22? George: see how things go. If anything is achieved, it should be in 1990 or later. With modern equipment, we shall be able to hear signals that were buried in the noise in 1979. 4. Drive Spiros Tsaltis Sfonit and George Delicaris Sfonum. Mobile. The first two licensed amateurs to make contact on 2 meters in Greece were Drive Spiros Tsaltis Sfonit and George Delicaris Sfonum. They had put together the famous Hefkit tour. Crystals were plentiful on the surplus market, but it was not easy to find two of the same frequency. Sfonit transmitted on 144, 720, and Sfonum on 145, 135 ms. The first contact took place at 13:30 local time on the 21st of December 1963. A few days later Sfonit had a cross-band XO with George Vernerdakis Svonum, who was transmitting in the 20-meter band on 14,215 m. As he had not completed his tour yet. At that time Sfonit was the secretary of the Radio Amateur Association of Greece. He suggested to the committee that the club should apply for a temporary license to be granted to Sfonum, enabling him to transmit from his vehicle while in motion. The licensing authority gave the license for experimental purposes only, and for a period not exceeding 1 month. And so it was that the first mobile XO took place on 2 meters between licensed Greek amateurs on the 27th of January 1965 at 19:25 local time. Sfonum was traveling in his car and Sfonit was at his home. 5. Kostas Tsezourlidis Spourig. Saf. In 1970 Kostas Tsezourlidis Spourig built a unique electromechanical machine using 2 motors to achieve horizontal and vertical scanning. He had found a motor which rotated at 960 rpm, which corresponds to 16 revolutions per second. The exact speed required for the horizontal scanning. The speed of the second motor was 1 revolution per second. The reciprocal motion was produced by a cam through an 8-1 reduction gear. A weight attached to the microscope pulled it back to start the next line. The microscope was focused sharply on the drum carrying the picture to be transmitted. Resolution was excellent. The microscope consisted of a cardboard tube with a 13 focal length lens at one end and a Philips OAP12 photodiode at the other with another lens in front of it. This primitive microscope produced a picture of reasonable quality. For reception Spourig made a converter using the long persistence 7C RT. With this setup Kostas had his first SOV contact on 40 meters with Sfonum on February 28, 1971. After that he had many contacts on 7 and 14 as can be seen from the extract from his log. The special commemorative prefix of 0 was used by all stations during 1971. 6. Costas Giorgio, Sfonio, M. Up to the end of 1988, the only Greek amateur who had positively authenticated moon-bounce contacts was Kostas Georgios Sfonio. His very first contact was made in 1982 when he contacted Visivent in Canada on 2 meters. In the ensuing 4 years, Kostas managed to work 4 more stations: Combs, Sferg, Fivon, and Piter. In 1982, Kostas had been trying for 3 years, without success, to hear his own signal via moon bounce. The reason for his failure was that he was unaware of a very basic fact. I was completely ignorant of the Doppler shift effect. Kostas told me, "The frequency of received signals varies according to the position of the moon. If it is to the east of your own location, the signals return 500 to 1. 0 is below the original transmitted frequency." For years I had been sending long dashes slowly and waiting to hear my signals return on the same spot, which they never did. This happens for one instant only, when the moon is at 180 degrees azimuth, exactly due south. When it moves to the west of south, the returning frequency is correspondingly higher. Using a 50s audio filter, which is essential for moon bounce, it is very easy to miss the weak signals. Soon after I found out my ridiculous mistake, I began to hear my signals, naturally with a delay of 1 or 2 seconds because of the enormous distance involved. 770, 0 kilometers. 385, 0 there and 385, 0 back. Kostas continued. My next problem was finding the moon. I had no computer at the time and no Keplerian elements. I mounted a small video camera in the center of 4 16-element Yagi antennas and rotated the elevation and azimuth motors until I could see the moon in the center of the monitor in the shack. Of course, when the sky was overcast, I was out of business. Much later, when I obtained a little Sinclair ZIT computer, life became easier. When I made my first contact, I was simultaneously in so with Sfonab and Sfonio on 296 who could hear what was going on. I remember Sfonab got very excited and began shouting, "I can hear him. I can hear him." The XO was with Visivent. Later Lionel sent me a very valuable present. Valuable not for its cost, but for the fact that it was something quite unobtainable in Greece at that time. A very low noise preamplifier for 2 meters. After the successful launch of Oscar 10, those amateurs who had complex antenna systems and low noise receivers they had used for moon bounce congregated on 145, 950 and spoke to each other on KRP, which prevented ordinary mortals from hearing them. By KRP I mean outputs of half a watt or less. But when finally one day I broke into a net, so I arranged schedules for moon bounce with 2 stations in Sweden. I had a successful contact with one of them, but never heard the other. The reason may have been a very simple one. The polarization of signals returning from the moon varies from one moment to the other. So if you have been transmitting with horizontal polarization and go over to reception, it is very easy to miss the answer of the other station if the polarization has changed. Sfonio then explained the very strict procedure which must be adhered to for moon bounce schedules. Schedules are arranged to last 1 hour. The first station to start transmitting on the hour must be the one whose lies to the east of the other. The calling frequency for moon bounce is 144, 11s, and the duration of the call is 2 minutes. But for the first minute and a half you call to Sfonio, and during the last half minute you also give the call of the station you are trying to contact. For instance, brief to Sfonio. You must on no account transmit for more than 2 minutes, because at the beginning of the 3rd minute the other station will begin transmitting the same pattern of signals. But if he has heard you, he will alter the pattern. For the first half minute He will send Sponio de Kriefge, and for the ensuing minute and a half he will transmit the letter O, which signifies that he has heard your calzing completely and without difficulty. 5 in the Q code. If I have also heard your calzing completely, I will send Kriefge for half a minute followed by Rho for a minute and a half, which means that I have also received your calzing and your O, and you will reply Rho 73, which concludes the successful contact. There are 1 or 2 other letters that can be used. Sending M signifies that I hear you well but can only copy 50 of your transmission, equivalent to 3. And the letter T signifies I hear you but cannot read you at all. Cone. It has been found by experience that the best sending speed is 8W p. M. Sending slowly or very fast presents problems at the other end. Chapter 8. Personal Reminiscences and Anecdotes. The 8 items which follow are not strictly part of the story of the development of amateur radio, but they deal with some historical events which are connected with our hobby. 2 are of particular interest. The account given to me by Takis Cambias, formerly Spony, of the early days of amateur radio in Russia, and the story of the Greek broadcasts from Cairo, Egypt, during the German-Italian occupation of Greece in World War I. Nearly all the photographs of the period were taken by the author. 1. Athanasios Takis Cambias, 1909–1987. When I met Takis in his office in May 1983, I told him I was thinking of writing a small book about the history of amateur radio in Greece before it was too late. So many of the old-timers had already passed away. Little did we both suspect at the time that he also would not live to see the finished project. I asked him how far back he could remember. Well, I can start from 1924, when I was about 15 and living in Odessa in the Soviet Union. There was a lot of interest in wireless, and 2 magazines were published in Russia which dealt mainly with the construction of receivers. My interest was first aroused when a friend of mine at school proudly showed me something he had just made. It was, he told me, a variable capacitor, and he was going to use it to make a radio receiver. The contraption was enormous by today's standards and must have weighed about half a kilo. My friend said it had a capacity of 250 microfarads, which meant absolutely nothing to me at the time. When he completed his receiver, I became very interested and decided I would build one too. But materials were hard to find and very expensive. 2 items one had to buy: valves and headphones. I asked my friend where he had found the sheet metal to make the plates of the capacitor. He took me to a row of small shops which had a metal-faced ledge below the shop window. The metal was thin and seemed easy enough to remove. We sat on the ledge for a while, and when the coast was clear we tore away a section and ran like mad. Later I ruined a pair of my mother's dressmaking scissors, cutting out the plates. I used rings of some thick copper wire to space the plates, but I could not drill holes in the plates for the spindle, so a friend did that for me. I used about 15 plates, and to this day I have no idea what the capacity of the finished capacitor was. Some small items for the receiver could be found in a little shop owned by an old man who charged exorbitant prices. So I decided I must go to Moscow for the valve and a single headphone that I needed. But Moscow was 3 days and 2 nights away by train, and it was the middle of winter. So what? You may ask. Like many others, I had to travel on the roof of a goods wagon. I took with me a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, and 2 hard-boiled eggs. My father said I must be mad, but he gave me some spending money and his blessing. I had eaten my food by the end of the 2nd day, so when we stopped at Brentsk, which is famous for its piroshki, I decided to try them. They were kept warm in large metal tins ready for the arrival of the train. There were 7 varieties, and I had one made with liver and a Savory sauce. When I arrived in Moscow, I went to see the Greek ambassador, as I was carrying a letter of introduction from my father, who was acting consul for Greece in Odessa. But it was Saturday, and the ambassador's office was closed. I learned later that only foreign establishments closed at the weekend. So I went to look for a cheap hotel. Looking out of the bedroom window, I saw a lot of people running in one direction. At that moment a woman brought me a towel and a small bar of soap. So I asked her what was going on outside. She said the butcher near the hotel had just received some liver. Would she buy me some, I said. I gave her some money, and she returned nearly 2 hours later with the liver wrapped in newspaper. When I opened it I saw it was horse liver cooked with corn, and it had an awful sour smell. I just could not face it. Although I was starving by now, I asked Takis about the shops in Moscow. He said he had found several shops with parts and some made-up receivers in the state-owned shops. He learned later that these receivers were made by amateurs because the factories only made equipment for the armed forces. He bought a tried valve called micro, and was told it had an amplification factor of 7. He wrapped it carefully in cotton wool for the return journey to Odessa. He also bought a dry battery pack which gave 80 volts, and an enormous single headphone for one ear which was ex-army surplus. When he returned home and began to build his receiver, he raided his mother's kitchen to build things like terminals, switches, etc. There was an electric bell circuit between the dining room and the kitchen, and as they did use it, his mother said, he could dismantle it and use the wire, which was quite long because it went up into the loft and then down again to the kitchen. I had acquired a small square of bakelite, and I used a penknife to make a holder for the valve, twisting a few turns of wire round the pins, as I could find nothing to use as a socket. I had no idea how to connect the various items I made or bought. I had seen a circuit diagram in a French magazine of a detector with reaction. I made the connections by twisting wires together, and finally the receiver was complete. The next thing was the aerial. I made an enormous aerial with 4 parallel wires, like the aerials I had seen on ships. Putting it up was a dangerous operation, as our house had a rather steep tiled roof, so I got some friends to help. Some of them who had superior knowledge told me the down lead must have no bends. I got hold of a stiff copper wire and supported the down lead on 2 enormous bell insulators as used on telegraph poles. I had to smash a corner of my bedroom window to bring the wire in. I had bought a large knife switch which could be turned over to connect the aerial to ground. I was afraid the large flat top of the aerial would attract thunderbolts. When I finally connected the aerial to the receiver, I heard absolutely nothing. I asked him how he tuned the receiver. He said he had put many taps on the coil, and he twisted his antenna to these taps, trying various combinations with the tuning capacitor. All I heard was this breathing noise. I learned later that it was the carrier wave of a broadcasting station without modulation, but I didn't know what that meant. As my friends also heard the same noise, I was convinced my receiver was working. We soon found out that the long-wave transmitter at Ankara, the capital of Turkey, was making test transmissions without modulation. Ankara was one of the first broadcasting stations in that part of the world. Norman, regeneration should have produced a whistle. Takis. Yes, indeed. And in a peculiar way, when I approached the receiver, my hand produced the whistle. Norman. Hand capacity effect. Takis. And foot capacity effect as well. When I approached my knee to the metal leg of the workbench, I would lose the station I had been listening to. He said the tuning capacitor he had made was obviously too small, and he had to alter the taps on the coil continuously. About 3 o'clock in the morning during a cold winter night he heard a new sound, the breathing carrier noise, and a sort of regular ticking. He later found out that it was the new broadcasting station in Vienna, Austria, which transmitted the sound of a metronome throughout the night. This would have been about 1926. I asked Takis about school. In spite of the late nights listening, I never missed a day at school. My father was the chairman of the school committee, and I can't let him down. But I had to earn some pocket money to pay for the bits of pieces I needed, particularly a decent pair of headphones. I had to hold the army headphone to me ear with one hand, which gave me pins and needles. For some years I had kept goldfish and pigeons, so I sold them. A friend of mine had gone to sea as a cadet, and his ship went abroad, so I asked him to get me a pair of headphones. I must explain to you that it was no easy matter for a Russian seaman to serve on a vessel which visited foreign ports. First one had to go through the Communist Party sieve, and then he was told that if he jumped ship his family would suffer for it. Anyway, he bought me a lovely pair of Telefunken headphones when the ship berthed at Constantinople, Istanbul, which I have to this day, but not on his first trip, when he was not allowed to go ashore. And it was not the captain who decided who could go ashore. A trusted member of the party would pick out a group of seamen who could land, but they had to stay together the whole time. I never managed to go abroad. At the club I had obtained a Morse test certificate for 40 letters, a minute 8 in Latin characters, and 90 letters 18. To go abroad one had to upgrade to 80 Latin and 120 Cyrillic letters, 16 and 24. I was put on a small coastal icebreaker which cleared the river estuaries in the Black Sea. The Black Sea is one of the most treacherous inland seas in the world. During the winter its northern shores are frozen, whereas the coast of Asia Minor keeps the southern shores relatively warm by comparison. This results in gale force winds and rough seas. Waves follow each other very closely as opposed to the long swell one gets in the Pacific. Ships have to leave port to avoid crashing into each other. I was about 18 when I first went to sea as a cadet with operator. One day when we came out of an estuary the sea was so rough that the captain decided to turn back. As we turned to starboard we noticed an American freighter behind us heavily laden with wheat and very low down in the water. To our horror it was caught between the crests of two enormous waves and broke in two roughly amidships. Although we were only about half a mile away, the freighter sank before we could get to it. We saw a few survivors in the water, but it would have been impossible to put a boat into that treacherous sea, apart from which a man cannot survive many minutes in a water temperature just above freezing. It was all over in a flash, and we returned to Odessa in deep shock. Odessa used to have 4 harbors. The Kalzign of the station was Ufivka. I remember it very well because it was my job to take the weather forecasts for shipping which it transmitted regularly. Takis spoke about some amusing misconceptions of that period. When he first completed his receiver and was getting poor results with it, he asked a more experienced amateur to look at it. The expert immediately found the first fault. The downlead from the antenna had a bend in it of more than 45 degrees, which was quite unacceptable. Secondly, the ground connection to the central heating radiator was no good because it was winter, and the radiator was hot, so it presented a very high resistance. It must be soldered, he said, to a cold water tap. I tried everything I could think of to solder the wire to the tap, but to no avail. Then one day I had a brain wave, and I made a stupendous invention. I wrapped a copper strip round the tap and bolted it tightly, together with the ground wire. I was really very proud of myself and wondered if anybody else had ever thought of doing it that way. I asked Takis if he had done any transmitting from home. We amateurs of foreign origin were not allowed to own transmitters, but we could operate the club station under close supervision by the party member. My own Solkalzig was Rook 1136, as you can see from the card I received from Ufivn in 1929. I remember our excitement when we first contacted a station outside Russia. It was a station in Saarbrücken, and we were on a wavelength of 42 meters. All the members of the club sent him our Sol reports, and he sent us back his cards and a photograph of his equipment, which was published in the Moscow Amateur Journal, and so Odessa became famous. On 42 meters most of our XOs were with German stations. As a result of this success many young lads joined our club, and we experts would explain to them about bends in the aerial down lead and the high resistance of a ground connection to a central heating radiator when the water in it was hot. The club transmitter consisted of 4 valves in a Hartley parallel push-pull oscillator circuit, which we considered to be of relative high power, perhaps all of 10 watts. Takis continued. In 1930, my family, like many other families of Greek origin, moved to Athens. I built a transmitter using 4 Phillips valves. I went and saw Mr. Eleftherio at the ministry, and he informed me that there was no way that he could issue me with a transmitting license. But he thanked me all the same for telling him I had built a transmitter. Takis continued. I would like you to notice these 2 cards I received in 1933. Yonip wrote on his card, I am on the air since 1924, but you are the first station I have heard. And the British listener Berselvin 83 wrote, dear old man, are you the only active station in SP? I think those comments speak for themselves. Norman, had you not heard about Tavaniotis, who had also emigrated from Russia? Takis, no. It was you who took me to the basement shack and introduced me. I remember how I gaped when I saw the 150-watt transmitter Bill had built. Takis then described how he had heard a distress signal on his homemade receiver. It was in a language he could not understand, so he called his father, who was quite a linguist, to listen. It appeared that the vessel had caught fire as it was approaching the port of Piraeus, south of Athens. The captain of the ship said their predicament was complicated by the fact that they were transporting a large circus, with many wild animals. Takis ran to the nearest police station and told his story, but was greeted practically with derision. How could a young lad like him know there had been a fire on a ship which was not even in sight of the shore? Anyway, somebody was brought to the station, and the officer said go with this man. Takis was taken to the coast at Paleo Faliro, where he boarded a salvage tug, and they set out to sea. He said the vessel in distress had been bound for Piraeus, and sure enough the salvage tug located it. But when they approached it there was no sign of fire, as it had been put out before any of the animals could be harmed. But the engine room had been damaged, so the tug towed the vessel into harbor. What Cambias didn't know was that by law he was entitled to a proportion of the salvage money, and he never got anything. Another incident involving a small yacht which belonged to a friend of Takis led to an interesting assignment. The yacht was considered to be not seaworthy any more, and a transmitter it carried was dismantled completely by an electrician who knew nothing about wireless. I was asked to put it together again by the owner, who wanted to sell it to the ship to shore station where they did not have a shortwave capability yet. When I was shown the parts I was horrified to see that there was no circuit diagram or instructions of any sort. It took me more than a month to figure it all out. The transmitter was of French manufacture and consisted of 2 enormous triads in a Hartley oscillator circuit. When I got it to work it was installed at the Naval Wireless Station at Votonikis, where the director, Captain Kyriakos Pesapoulos, used it for experimental transmissions. There were already 2 other transmitters there, one on long waves and one on 600 meters. The calzign of the station was XA. As this was the 3rd transmitter, they used the calzign scathry. The operator, Lieutenant George Basiukos, had discovered some telegraphy stations which replied when he called them. He had accidentally stumbled upon the amateur 20-meter band, with a transmitter supplied with unrectified C at 400 Hz, and a power output of several kilowatts. No wonder contacts with any part of the world were easy. When Captain Pesapoulos met Bill Tavaniotis, the latter suggested that if the experimental transmissions were to continue in the amateurs' bands, the calzign should be altered to SX3. Thousands of successful contacts were made, as it was the beginning of Sunspot Cycle 16. A very good one, as old-timers will know. If anyone reading this has a XL card from SX3, would be appreciated if he would donate it to the Technical Museum in Greece. Takis Cambias died suddenly of a heart attack in September 1987. 2. Paul Psomiadis Ntwodo, formerly Svonas. The text which follows was written by Paul Ntwodo of Bergenfield. Norman Joly and I first met in 1935 when I started working with Bill Svonek as his radio mechanic. Norman was then working for the local agents of Orca selling broadcast receivers. The last time I saw him before the war was in September 1939. I was still working with Bill, and I went to the British School of Archaeology in Athens to deliver a National 100 with a spiral all-band antenna. Norman had been recruited to set up a monitoring station for the press department of the British Embassy, which had been moved to a building in the grounds of the school. After the end of the war, I saw him again in 1948 in the uniform of a superintendent of police working in the British police mission to Greece. He told me he had obtained a special license and was back on the air with his pre-war Calzign phoners. In 1951, I emigrated to Brazil, where I stayed for 17 years and then came to the U.S. In 1968, where I have been ever since. We had lost contact with each other, and it was 5 years later that I found Norman's address in the American Cal book. I wrote to him, and in his reply he begged me to come on the air again, owing to a prolonged family illness which culminated in the loss of my beloved wife. It was 1980 before I was in the mood to take up amateur radio once again, with my present Calzig. Twodo. When I went to London in 1984 to spend a few weeks with Norman, he told me he had started recording some reminiscences on a tape recorder about the first radio amateurs in Greece, and he asked me if I would like to help. As I was one of them myself, I agreed. When I left to return to the U.S., he gave me a number of cassettes to transcribe, although he speaks fluent Greek without any accent at all. He never attended a Greek school and cannot write the memories. He told me to add anything else I could remember about those pioneering days long gone by. So, to start from the beginning, let me say that I was born in Constantinople, now Istanbul, in Turkey, in October 1910, of Greek parents. Although we spoke Greek at home, I did not go to a Greek school until I was 9. But I soon moved to the French college, where all the lessons were in French, and Greek was only taught as a foreign language for 2 hours every afternoon. My elder brother had subscribed to a French magazine called La Science et la Vie, Science and Life, and I had become fascinated by a subject called telegraphy sans fil, telegraphy without wire. The broadcasting of speech and music had not started yet in that part of the world, though in 1923 a broadcasting station was built in Ankara, the capital of Turkey. Broadcast receivers began to appear in the shops, either with headphones or large horn loudspeakers. But we never had one at home. In 1926 we moved to Athens, Greece, where I went to school. Strangely enough, as I found out later, that was the year when Norman also came to Athens for the first time. At school I met Nasso's Kukolis, later Svons and Svonik, who was also very interested in wireless. I made a crystal receiver and was able to hear the Greek Royal Navy station at Votinikis Sksa and the old station at Thyssen in Athens itself, which was still a spark station. There just was nothing else to hear. I acquired a Phillips-type valve and built a grid leak detector circuit, but all I got was silence. The 4-volt heater drew 1 amp, and I had been trying to get it going with a small torch battery. As I became more experienced, I began repairing simple broadcast receivers for my friends and putting up wire antennas for reception for people who had bought broadcast receivers. In 1929 Nasso's and I were in our final year at the Megario's school. We built a very simple transmitter tuned to about 500 meters, and we broadcast the performance of a play acted by the final year students. I have no idea if anybody heard our transmission, but it was certainly the first amateur broadcast in Greece. Nassos and I spoke to each other with very simple transmitters across the 60 meters or so separating our homes, again without knowing whether anybody else ever accidentally tuned into our very low power transmissions. In 1932 I was called up for my compulsory military service and ended up attending the Reserve Officers' Cadet School. After my military training I started work at the Lambropoulos brothers' shop in the Metoic-Tamian building. It was there that I made the acquaintance of Takis Kambias, who had come to Greece from Russia with his family. Takis had had 8 years' experience of amateur radio in Russia, and he told us how the radio clubs operated under the strict supervision of the Communist Party. 3 years later, in 1935, I moved to Tavaniotis' workshop as his mechanic. Bill had built an Ammon transmitter with an output of 150 watts. He used the Calzign Sponek. We had regular contacts with George Mons Sunero in Cairo, Egypt. George is still active in his native land of Belgium with the Calzign en Fivro in Brussels. He should be well into his itis by now. In 1938 George came to Athens with his wife Biba and their little boy Robert to visit her parents who were Greek. And of course they came to our shack, and we had the pleasure of meeting them in person after many years of chatting over the air. In Greece we are 7 hours ahead of Eastern Standard Time, and so our contacts with the U.S. took place well after midnight, our time. One of the stations we contacted very regularly was Charles Mellon Wonf in Boston. Charles was born in Boston of Greek parents. His father came to Greece in 1936 or 1937 with Charles' younger sister, a pretty little girl of about 14. They came to Bill's shack and were able to speak to Boston with the equipment shown in this photograph taken by Norman. After the end of World War I Wonf together with Uzixim of California were the 2 leading stations in the U.S. Topping all the achievement tables. But Uzixim had a slight advantage. He had bought a site previously belonging to Press Wireless, which had 36 rhombics, whereas Wonf always operated with his simple Yagi at 60 feet. Another station with which we had frequent contacts on 20 meters was Foy, owned by Dorothy Hall. One night Dorothy gave us a big surprise. In the course of XO she told us to listen carefully. Suddenly the 3 or 4 of us in Sponix shack heard our voices coming back from New York. Dorothy had recorded our previous transmission on a disc. A few days later we turned the tables on her. We had hastily put together some recording equipment and played back her transmission. Dorothy said that was the first time she had heard her voice coming from 50 miles away. I must explain that at that time about 1933 home recording was a novelty even in the U.S. Recording on vinyl tape was invented by Telefunken towards the end of the war in 1945. Today even little children play with cassette recorders. And the latest revolutionary home recording system invented by Japan, DAT digital audio tape, provides high-fidelity studio quality with no background noise. Really a super version of the mini cassette recorder. In Athens we continued to operate even through the dictatorship of General Metaxas, which began with a coup in August 1936, but not without some problems. The main target of the infamous Maniadakis, Minister of the Interior under Metaxas, were of course the Communists, but the handful of radio amateurs also came under suspicion of being subversive elements. Things got worse. In fact, when the newspaper Estia, owned by K. Hero, published an article blaming amateurs for being responsible for interference to shortwave reception. I must explain that the writer was referring to the dozens of pirate low-power broadcasting stations operating in the medium-wave broadcast band. Regrettably, I have to place on record that owing to the late development of broadcasting and official recognition of amateur radio in Greece, the word amateur in the minds of the general public embraces curs. Pirates of all kinds operating on medium waves and recently in the band, and genuine licensed amateurs as well. So, as I was working in the basement workshop at Sponex one afternoon, 3 of Maniatakis plainclothes men turned up. Fortunately, Bill was not in the shop when they came. I asked them if they had a search warrant, and they said no. I replied that I was only an employee, and could they call back a little later when Mr. Tavaniotis himself would be there to answer their questions, and thus managed to get rid of them. When Bill returned I told him about the incident, and he left straight away and went to the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs to see Mr. Stefanos Eleftherio. And so it came about that Eleftherio, who knew all about our activity in the amateur bands, issued the first 3 licenses to Sponica and Sponing to carry out experimental transmissions relating to the study of propagation on the short waves. He knew that he had every right to do this, as Greece was a signatory to the international telecommunication treaties. I would like to record at this point that Agiskaz's Sponica, now a silent key, has left his own monument in Athens. After the end of World War I, in his capacity as head of lighting development with the Electricity Authority, he designed the magnificent fluid lighting of the Acropolis, which is admired by tourists to the present day. To return to 1937, Mr. Eleftherio entrusted us with the task of preparing draft legislation for legalizing amateur radio activity. We wrote to the U.S., to England, France, and Germany, and obtained copies of the laws governing the issue of licenses in all these countries. And we began the long task of drafting a text which would be appropriate to the political situation then prevailing in our country, military dictatorship. Norman Joly, then Sponers, had written a text in English, but before we could translate it into Greek or do anything about it, all our hopes were dashed to the ground by the outbreak of war in September 1939. In 1944, while serving as a reserve officer in the Greek army, I was seconded to the British military mission to Greece, VM, because of my knowledge of English and French. There I met several amateurs serving with the British forces, and one of them gave me a small military transmitter. So I was able to come on the air again with my old Kalzignov. Sponas. 3. Constantine Bill Tavaniotis, formerly Sponek. There is no doubt that the most active and best-known amateur in Greece before World War I was Bill Sponek. He was active on 20 and 10 meters on M-phone and using his famous McElroy bug to good advantage. No electronic kyres and no 15-meter band in those years. Tavaniotis was born in Rostov, a Sir, of Greek parents. His father was a well-known doctor. Like many other Greek families, Bill and his parents left Russia in the early years of the communist regime and moved to Istanbul, Turkey, where he began his studies at the famous Robert College. Later he went to London, where he first came into contact with radio amateurs, while studying electrical engineering. After that he went to Belgium. Bill had a knack of picking up languages, and when I met him in Athens in the early 30s he spoke at least 7, to my knowledge: Russian, Greek, English, French, Italian, Turkish, and German. His pronunciation in all them was excellent. On one occasion at a party in the Athens suburb of Palaeopsychico, one of the guests was an amateur from Italy who spoke no English. So Bill interpreted from that language into Italian for his benefit. He then translated what the Italian had said into English for the others. But suddenly their faces went blank. Quite unconsciously, Bill had translated the Italian's remarks into Turkish. Many years later Bill was employed at the United Nations in New York as a simultaneous translator. In October 1946 Bill and his wife Artemis visited Charles Mellon Wonf in Boston for an eyeball after more than 10 years of XOs over the air, with the exception of the war years, of course. Chas photographed Bill outside the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Bill photographed Mary Chas Xil. Chas and Artemis standing in front of the Wonf Tower. The first transmitter he built can be seen in the photo taken from the book Greek Broadcasting published by Radio Karazhny in 1952. His shack was in the basement workshop at Seventina, Bucharest Street in Athens, an address which became known worldwide as the first Sloviv Bureau for Greece. The gang of enthusiasts who met at Bill's included NASA's Kukolis Svones, Agis Kazazes Svonica, Nick Katsalis Svonink, Mike Spadusi Svonump, Paul Psomidis Svonas Noun Twodo, and the writer of these memoirs. Svoners. Of course, all visiting amateurs made a beeline for the shack in the basement, as most of our contacts were with the U.S. We were usually up most of the night because of the 7-hour difference with Eastern Standard Time. None of us had motor cars, and public transport was not available during the night hours, so we all got plenty of exercise walking back to our respective houses. Bill was closely in touch with two men who played a very important role in the development of amateur radio in Greece. I am referring to Stefanos Eleftherio, who was section head for telecommunications at the ministry, Greek initials T, and to Captain Kyriakos Pezopoulos, director of D.R.Y.N, Greek initials for Directorate of the Wireless Service of the Navy, the long-wave spark transmitter at Votonikis, a suburb of Athens. Kalzinsk had been built by the Marconi Company before World Bill Tavaniotis died of cancer in 1948. 4. Harry Barnett Twoweek formerly Svon. In July 1946, Harry Barnett, a Royal Air Force officer attached to the press department of the British Embassy in Athens, obtained an experimental transmitting license from the section of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs with the Kalzin Svon. At that time he was living in a flat in Athens and could not put up an antenna. So it was not until June 1947 that he became active. The terms of his license were in themselves rather strange. One might even say quite experimental. The final paragraph reading, "This experimental research must be carried out as follows. 1. With a maximum power of 50 watts. 2. In the frequency bands harmonics 130, 260, 520 mix. 3. In the frequency bands 28 mix and 56 mix. 4. With the call sign Svon. From June 1947 until April 1948, Harry worked 61 countries, mostly on phone in the 10 and 20-meter bands, at a time when there were not many stations on the air, a minute fraction of the millions now active. He used a National Pro receiver he had got off a scrap heap, which he modified to take the efficient F50 valves in the R.F. stages and F39s in the I.F. The transmitter was completely homebrew, consisting of a metal 6x6 Franklin oscillator on 3 5s followed by two more 6x6 doubling to 14s. In the final amplifier stage, Harry used a Telefunken pentode, the famous and very efficient Rule 12 F35, which was used in the German tank transmitters in all stages. Oscillator P. An audio amplifier suppressor grid modulator. He adopted the same method of modulation using a record player amplifier and an astatic crystal microphone. C. was achieved by February 1948 with about 50 watts of RF into a simple dipole antenna. During the 10 months that Svone was active, 750 XL cards were sent out. Of the 61 countries worked, only 49 were confirmed. Today, 1,989 Harry is still regularly on the air under his original Kalsing Twoik, which was first issued to him on the 1st of January 1938, 51 years ago. 5. George Yiopapis, formerly Svanagy. George Yiopapis is a Greek amateur who was very active for over 25 years, yet nobody seems to have heard of him. In 1935, George and his father Costas built a one-valve transmitter using a Type 59 pentode with suppressor grid modulation, and succeeded in contacting most of the world with this Krupp rig. The electron-coupled oscillator could not have put more than 4 or 5 watts into the antenna. After the war, George went to Jordan in 1956 to work for Cable and Wireless, the English company which operated the old Eastern Telegraph cable network. He used the Kalsing Jianji for about a year and was then transferred to Tripoli in the Kingdom of Libya during the reign of King Idris, where he obtained an official license with the Col Fivathrita. In 1960 he was again transferred, this time to Kuwait, where he operated the equipment of Mohammed Bebeni Nenektwom for over 6 years. George now has a small shop in Piraeus, the port of Athens, and is no longer active on the amateur bands. 6. Stefanos Eleftherio, 1895–1979. Stefanos Eleftherio, head of the telecommunications section of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, Greek initials T, played a vital role in the early development of amateur radio in Greece. When he returned from Switzerland, where he had studied electrical engineering, he had to do his compulsory military service, which had been deferred while he was completing his education. A friend of his told him, "Don't go into the army. Join the navy. They have an amazing wireless station at Votonikis with which they can contact the fleet anywhere in the world." As it happened, there was a vacancy for an officer, and Stefanos, together with another young man called Nicholas, faced a selection board of naval officers who really didn't know what qualifications they were looking for. He was successful, whereas Nicholas went to the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, where he ended up as Director General many years later. The Marconi Company of England had built an impressive wireless station for the Greek Royal Navy at Votonikis, a suburb of Athens. There was a transmitter which operated on 600 meters and a larger one on long waves above 2.0 meters, which used the Kalsing. Stefanos told me how he was summoned by the director of the naval station, Admiral Mezaviras, who asked him, "Tell me, young man." "Well, sir," replied Eleftherio, "I studied electrical engineering in Switzerland. I really don't anything about wireless." "Neither do I," replied the admiral candidly, "nor do most of my officers. We must set up a school to train technicians and wireless operators. I entrust you with the task of getting all the necessary books and other materials. Write to England, the U.S., France and Germany, and get whatever you need. When you are ready I will appoint staff to assist you." That was how Eleftherio became the head of the first school for training wireless officers for the Greek Royal Navy. A couple of years later Eleftherio joined the staff of the Ministry of Post and Telegraphs. A newspaper of 1930 had a photograph of him with one of his triplet sons. In his capacity of head of the telecommunications section at the ministry, he worked hard to get official recognition of amateur radio. A handful of us, who were active under cover, so to speak, frequently visited him in his office. He was a very likable person and had a talent for anecdotes. One day he told us that he had attended a joint services committee which had been set up to study the requirements for building a broadcasting station in Athens. A station had been in regular operation in the northern city of Thessaloniki Salonika since 1928, built by the pioneer of broadcasting in the Balkans, Christos Tsingeridis. When the question of wavelength for the proposed station was considered, somebody said a wavelength of 2.0 meters might be appropriate. One of the military officers, who shall be nameless, remarked angrily, "What? 2.0 meters? We are spending all this money only to be received up to Kalkovounds? This is outrageous." Kalkovounds was then a small village with a funny name about 3 miles southwest of Athens. Eleftherio lived to the ripe old age of 84. When I last saw him he promised to give me his collection of old photographs and a large number of books and documents relating to the development of radio communications in Greece. Unfortunately, shortly after his death his wife and 3 sons moved house temporarily, and a packing case containing all these priceless papers was lost in 7 Norman F. Joly, formerly Svoners. I was born in Izmir, then known as Smyrna, on the west coast of Turkey in Asia Minor, in 1911, of British parents. My British nationality was established through the Treaty of Capitulation, which was then in force between Turkey and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I remember there was a British post office in Smyrna, and we posted our letters with British postage stamps of King Edward overprinted with the word Levant. My grandmother on my father's side had come from Russia. It is a strange coincidence that Takis Cambias ex Svoni, Viltaveniotis ex Svonek, and I all had roots in southern Russia. My grandmother on my mother's side was the daughter of the Dutch consul in Smyrna. Quite a mixed bag. In 1922, at the end of the war between Turkey and Greece, the town of Smyrna was destroyed by fire when the Greek army was routed. My widowed mother, with 4 young children, was advised to take us on board a British merchant vessel while the town changed hands. We were told to take a little food with us just for a day or 2. We carried a large string bag with some bread, cheese, and fruit, and 1 knife, 1 fork, and 1 spoon between the 5 of us. I remember it was night, and my mother put all her jewelry in a small leather bag. As I pulled the cord to close it, the pin of a large brooch stuck out through the top. My mother grabbed it and said I would hurt myself. I was only 11 years old at the time. She looked around the bedroom, lifted up a corner of the mattress of her bed, and hid the pouch safely underneath it. We hurried out of the house and never went back. We and many other families spent one night on the merchant vessel, where there was no sleeping accommodation. Next morning we were transferred to a large hospital ship called Maine. All day we watched small groups of the Turkish and Greek armies skirmishing on the sea front, and in the evening many fires broke out in the town. In the middle of the night, while we were sleeping, the hospital ship sailed away to an unknown destination. After 2 or 3 days we arrived in Malta, where most of us stayed for the next 4 years. It was in Malta that my interest in wireless telegraphy was first aroused. We were housed in some military married quarters. Close by there was a wireless station which produced bright greenish-blue sparks and crackling noises. Its antennas were supported on 3 very tall wooden masts painted bright yellow. I soon discovered that it was JIS belonging to the Admiralty. Malta was then 1922, a very big base of the British Navy. In the good old days when England had an empire, I bought a kit of parts and assembled a small receiver, and being so close to the powerful spark transmitter, that was all I ever heard. In 1926, when I left school, my family moved to Greece, and my brother, who was 7 years older than me, opened up a shipping office on the island of Mytilene, in the Aegean Sea. My father and grandfather had been in this business in Turkey. It was in Mytilene in 1927 that I constructed my first short-wave receiver. It had 3 valves with 4-volt filaments. heated by an accumulator storage battery. T of 130 volts was obtained from a bank of small accumulators in series. As I had not learned how to make a charger, I had to carry these two units to a local garage regularly for recharging. Apart from commercial telegraph stations, there was little else to hear. I had still not heard about amateur radio. The V.C. was carrying out test transmissions from Chelmsford for what became the Empire Service, now the World Service, using the Calzign fives. There was also Sixirks, which stood for Rugby Experimental, operated by the British Post Office. They were experimenting with ship-to-shore telephony, and after setting up a circuit the operator used to say over to condition, and sometimes B, which was very frustrating for me, because the voices then became scrambled and quite unintelligible, when I first began transmitting 6 years later. Having discovered the amateurs, I chose the Calzign works as I had been a listener so long, and also remembering the excitement of listening to Sixirks. In 1930 I moved to Athens and became a salesman for radios. It was there that I met Bill Tavaniotis Svonek and his mechanic Paul Svonas Nountwodo. None of us had official licenses because the Greek state did not recognize the existence of amateur radio, and in fact Athens did not even have a broadcasting station until 1938. Although a station had been operating since 1928 in Salonika, Thessaloniki, the second largest city of Greece. But the head of the section at the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, Greek initials T. Mr. Stefanos Eleftherio, knew all about us and gave us his unofficial blessing. My first transmitter was just an electron-coupled oscillator using a Type 59 output pentode from a radio. With an input of around 5 watts I was able to achieve W.C. on 14s in 25 minutes one very exciting afternoon. There were very few stations around, and single frequency working had not been heard of yet. It was the middle of the sunspot cycle, which I knew nothing of, and propagation must have been exceptionally good. Another thing we had never heard of in those innocent days was Sir. I had a hot wire ammeter and always tuned for maximum deflection, completely oblivious of the fact that a large proportion of the indicated value was reflected power. I moved to high power when I added a 210p to my rig. Obviously the prefix was quite a rare one, and stations were much sought after, particularly the handful who used. But as I described in a short article in the October 1948 issue of the Short Wave magazine published in London, it was not all fun being a rare station. A photocopy appears below. To return to pre-World War I operating. Most operators used crystal oscillators in order to have a clean 9x note. It was quite normal procedure to call SCON one's crystal frequency, say 1476, and then go over and start combing the band from 14. 0 for replies. At that time 20 meters covered 14, 0 to 14, 400s, and the 15-meter band had not been allocated to the amateur service. In September 1939 Hitler invaded Poland, and all of us hastily and voluntarily dismantled our transmitters and scattered the components, as there was nobody to order us to close down. In the latter part of April 1941 the German army marched into the northern suburbs of Athens at 11 o'clock in the morning. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the same day, a strong unit of the Gestapo arrived in the southern suburb of Calathi and surrounded the block in which my house was situated and broke into it, looking for me and my transmitter. Of course I had dismantled everything 19 months previously and even taken down the antenna. So after this long period of how did they know where to find me? Well, 4 years earlier I had won the first prize for Greece in the S. D. contest for 1,937, and the German Society had sent me a nice certificate. You can draw your own conclusions. I heard later, because I had left a few days earlier for Egypt with the staff of the British Embassy, that the Gestapo had visited all the active amateurs and had managed to arrest only one of them, Nasso's Kukolis Svons, later Svonik, and put him in a concentration camp in Italy for nearly a year. I would like to sketch briefly the turbulent events of the following 3 years with some extracts from my diaries. 1 year earlier, in 1940, following the invasion of Greece by the Italian army operating from Albania, the Broadcasting Authority in Athens, Ithnikin Idrima Radiophonias, began a news service in English which was beamed to England and the U.S. on the short waves. In my capacity as a member of the press department staff of the British Embassy, I took part in the first program, and in fact read the first news bulletin, which went out at 3 a.m. Athens time. As I said above, early in April I was transferred to the British Embassy in Cairo, Egypt. 1941. Very small contingents of the British Army landed in Greece to help the Greek army, but they proved totally incapable of standing up to the onslaught of the German army, which followed soon after. The Greek army laid down its arms in Epirus, northwestern Greece. General Tsolakaglau became the first Quisling Prime Minister of Greece. King George and his government, under Premier Emanuel Tsoudaros, had left for Cairo. 1942. In North Africa, General Rommel had advanced to within 100 miles of Cairo, but his supply lines had become very long. One of the most important was the railway link through Greece. So the British strategists decided that attempts must be made to disrupt it. The Special Operations Executive S.O.E. in London dispatched 2 small groups of saboteurs, about a dozen men altogether, under the command of Brigadier Eddie Myers and Major Chris Woodhouse, who had the task of linking up with the various bands of Andartis resistance movement fighters which had started forming in the mountains. Unfortunately, the British officers were told nothing at all about the bitter rivalries between the various groups, most probably because H.Q. in Cairo were themselves ignorant about the real situation. It didn't take Myers and Woodhouse long to discover that by far the largest group was ELS, the Popular Liberation Army under Reis Velauhitis, about 120 ill-equipped men operating in the Pindus Mountains. Another smaller group of about 60 men had rallied round a regular officer of the Greek army, Colonel Napoleon Zirvas. They called themselves the National Republican Greek League, Greek initials DES. I met Zirvas personally years later, when he was Minister of the Interior and therefore responsible for the police. I was then acting as interpreter for the assistant head of the British police mission to Greece. I remember vividly with what relish he described to Colonel Prosser his method of torturing prisoners, which left no physical marks on any part of the body. It was in the course of a secret visit to Athens that young Chris Woodhouse found out the real chain of command, when he was introduced to George Siantos, the secretary of the Greek Communist Party, Greek initials K.E. The K.E. controlled the National Liberation Front, which, in turn, ran ELS. But with a title like that National Liberation Front, it was easy to see why ELM enjoyed such widespread support, not only in the countryside, but also among the intelligentsia in Athens. But the task of the S.O.E. officers was made very difficult for various reasons. Winston Churchill had given orders that they were to support, as far as possible, only those guerrilla leaders who favored the king. but there were none, or very few. The S.O. units had orders to cause the maximum disruption to the German occupation of the country, and that was impossible without the support of the L.A.S., which was controlled by the Communists. At the outset, it became obvious to the S.O. officers that military and political priorities were already in conflict. The L.A.S. forces were getting stronger every day, and very soon they began attacking fellow Greeks in non-communist Andart units. The successful attack on the railway bridge over the Gorgopotamos River on the 26th of November was the first and last time that Ellis and Eads co-operated against the common enemy under the coercion and technical guidance of the British. 1943. Friction between Eads and Ellis continued to increase. When Eddie Myers told them that he had been instructed to destroy the bridge over the Asopos River, Ellis said it was too dangerous a target and refused to help. So this became an all-British operation. A 24-year-old demolition expert of the Royal Engineers, Captain Ken Scott, was sent from Cairo. He was dropped by parachute and planned the successful attack on the bridge. It took the Germans 4 months to rebuild it. On the 11th of September 14, 0 Italian troops in the northwest surrendered to the Andartes with all their arms. A month later, Ellis seized the weapons and attacked Eads. The Civil War had begun. 1944. The friction between the various groups of the resistance movement erupted into full-scale war, described as the Civil War or the guerrilla war depending on whose side you were on. Ellis were determined that they alone would be in control when the Allies arrived. As a result of intense negotiations on the part of the British officers, all the Andart leaders signed an armistice document on the 29th February 1944, agreeing to stop fighting each other and to concentrate all their efforts against the common enemy, the Germans. Unfortunately, barely a month later Ellis attacked and completely annihilated the smallest Andart group, E.K.K. Now only Eads and the 200-strong S.O. force stood between the 40. 0 Ellis communists and total control of the Greek countryside. In the Middle East, the Lebanon Conference, attended by delegates from all parties, including representatives of the Andartes, elected George Papandreou, father of Andreas Papandreou, recently Prime Minister of Greece, to act as Prime Minister of the Government of National Unity in exile. In September, the government moved temporarily to Italy. In October, following the withdrawal of the Germans from Athens, British troops began landing in Greece from Greek and British warships. By far the largest contingent landed near the port of Piraeus, and tens of thousands of Greeks turned out to cheer and welcome the British forces as they marched through the streets. On October 18, the members of the Greek government returned to Athens under the leadership of the Premier George Papandreou, who was accompanied by Lieutenant General Ronald Scobie, the Allied military commander. Sadly, though, in December Ellis marched on Athens. The British troops, so recently fated and garlanded, now found themselves fighting on the same streets of their earlier welcome. S.O. had been warning Cairo for 2 years that this might happen. After 3 or 4 weeks of intense fighting in the streets of Athens and in the suburbs, Ellis withdrew. Winston Churchill came to Athens on Christmas Day to mediate. A couple of Ellis snipers hiding in a school a few hundred yards away from the British embassy took a few pot shots at him as he got out of an armoured vehicle which had brought him from the airport. Next day, when he attended a meeting of all parties, the Ellis representative walked in wearing a military-style uniform with crossed bandoliers across his chest, and carrying 2 pistols. Churchill turned to his interpreter and said quietly, "Tell him to leave his toys outside, or I fly back to London immediately." to spend Christmas properly with my family. 1945. On the 1st of January, Archbishop Damaskinos was appointed regent. It had been agreed that the king should not return to Greece until his position had been clarified by a plebiscite. Plastiras replaced Papandreou as prime minister. After the Varkisa agreement, the guerrilla war or civil war was officially brought to an end. Years later, in a broadcast, Chris Woodhouse summarized what the S.O.E. mission to Greece had achieved. 1. It had provided the technical expertise, such as the handling of explosives, without which the major sabotage successes would have been impossible. 2. It had provided the tactical planning and supplied the communications which successfully harnessed the courage of the Greeks to the strategic requirements of the Allied commanders. 3. Most important of all, in the long run, it assured that no armed force in occupied Greece would gain a monopoly of power on the day of liberation. The final aim of the mission was to leave the Greeks with a free choice at the end of the war, a choice between a monarchy, a republic, or even a communist regime if they wanted it. But the recent dramatic events in the closing months of 1989 in Poland, the U.S.S.R. Hungary, the East German Democratic Czechoslovakia, and finally Romania have proved that the last choice would have been an unwise one if the Greeks had also opted for communism. 1946. Following a plebiscite, King George returned to Greece at the end of September and appointed Paneas Tsaldaris as his prime minister. When I returned to Athens in October 1944 on H.M.S. Avaroff, I had been appointed radio monitoring officer of the Anglo-Greek Information Service GIS, with a staff of about 25 operators and typists to assist me. My unit was a section of the press department of the British Embassy. I think the choice of title was a rather unfortunate mistake. The English words information and intelligence have only one equivalent word in Greek, plηροφορίσκη, and most Greeks hold peculiar views about the CIA and the British Intelligence Service. So here I was strutting about in the uniform of a war correspondent bearing the flashes I.S., the butt of many a joke from my friends who accused me of being a master spy. My boss, Colonel Johnson, who had been the British consul representative in Greece prior to the outbreak of war in 1939, came to my office one morning and told me that he had heard a rumor that King George of the Hellenes, who was then in London, was going to broadcast in the Greek service of the See, I replied, I had heard nothing, but would try and find out if the rumor was true. As he left my office, I glanced at my watch. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in London. I telephoned the general manager of cable and wireless, Mr. Briggs, who was a personal friend. I told him I wanted to make use of his facilities to ask an urgent question of the C in London. He replied, "Tell McTaggart, the engineer in charge of the Central Telegraph Office, that I said he should help you in any way possible." "Mac," I said over the telephone, "would you get one of your operators to ring the V v. C. in Bush House from where the World Service originates, and ask them if they have any plans for a broadcast by King George of the Helens. I immediately tuned one of my receivers to the frequency of the London telegraph link, which was carrying high-speed Morse traffic. In a short while the tape was stopped, and an operator, using a hand key, asked my question slowly in plain language. And then the tape was put on again. I waited anxiously for about 5 minutes. Again the tape was stopped. A single letter, "Arfa received," was sent by hand, and traffic returned to normal. My telephone rang. It was McTaggart. Nothing doing. Old boy. V. V. C. Have no plans for such a broadcast. I thanked him and looked at my watch. It was 11:25. Just 25 minutes had elapsed. I called my boss and told him the answer to his question. "How do you know?" he asked. I asked V. V. C. Sir. You what? He shouted at me, "Don't you know there's a war on? In coming to see you." He stormed into my office and demanded an explanation. So I told him what I had done. Good God! What is this going to cost us? Nothing at all. Sir, there is no provision for anything like that in the operating procedure. Then I must write a letter to cable and wireless to thank them. I thought to myself, why don't you write a letter to Norman and thank him for having friends in the right places? But I kept my mouth shut. My equipment and my staff of 20 men and 5 girls were housed on the 6th floor of the Matoacan-Tamian building when Ellis marched on Athens. There was constant firing, shelling and bombing throughout the 24 hours of the day and night for 3 or 4 weeks. The bombing was by light aircraft of the RAF on the Ellis positions in the suburbs and B-fighter aircraft strafing them with 20 cannon. Then Ellis set up a 75 gun in the northern suburb of Aharnan and started hitting us back when we had received several hits on and around our Q building. I was ordered to move down to the 2nd floor to safer accommodation. I extended some of my antenna down leads and resumed normal service. One of our assignments was to transcribe every day what was said in the Greek transmissions of 19 different countries about the situation in Greece, and to produce a daily summary in English for the benefit of the press department. In the summer of 1945 we began having interference on Gin, a station of the British Post Office which operated around Thames, transmitting a Reuters news service for Europe on the German Hellschreiber Hell printer system. This was a sort of very coarse television picture of 49 dots, 7 by 7. The letter I, for instance, came out as 7 dots vertically, and the letter T just had another 6 dots across the top. The letters were very crude but readable, provided there was no interference or crashes of static. The interference, which made our tape quite unreadable, used to start around 3 in the afternoon and fade slowly away about 3 hours later, when the tape became readable again. I decided I would try and identify the source. All I had in the way of recorders were office-type dictaphones using waxed cylinders. I removed the 3 weights from the speed governor, and the cylinder spun round like mad. I managed to record for about 3 minutes, and when I played the recording on another machine at normal speed the cylinder yielded up its secret. It was high-speed Morse traffic in 5-figure cipher. I typed it all out and noticed that some of the paragraphs began with the letter B. I subsequently found out it was a characteristic of stations carrying Royal Air Force traffic. I sent my text to London, and 3 weeks later the interference stopped. It was more than a month later that I was told what had happened. The transmitter causing the problem was located in Kandy, Ceylon. It operated with a rhombic antenna beamed to F, Calcutta. Its frequency was only 500 Hz away from Jin. The department which had allocated the frequency never imagined that it could possibly cause interference in Europe to the Reuters news service. But Sunspot Cycle 20, which was a good one, had decided otherwise. In 1947 I was transferred to the British police mission to Greece, which was headed by Sir Charles Wickham. My principal duty was to interpret for Sir Charles, and for his second-in-command, Colonel Prosser. My friend Mr. Eleftherio at the ministry issued me with a special license, and I came on the air again using my pre-war Calzignsphoners. When the police mission closed down in 1948, I came to England and got the Calzign which I have now held for over 41 years. 8. Wartime broadcasts from Cairo. Elias Elias goes. A former teacher of English at Athens College adjoint U.S. Greek institution described to me how he came to be a news reader at Radio Cairo in 1941, together with his brother Patroklos. When Hitler declared war on Greece, and after the collapse of the front in northern Greece and in Albania, my brother Patroklos and I were summoned to the British Embassy in Athens and told that owing to our close ties with the British Council of Cultural Relations, it would not be prudent for us to remain in Athens or even Greece after the German army had occupied the capital. We were told that we would be helped to leave Greece together with the British Embassy staff, the staff of the British Council, and all the British nationals in Greece. The British Consul General provided us with the necessary documents for my brother and me to board the last evacuation vessel sailing from the port of Piraeus. It was the Corinthia which left Piraeus on the 18th of April 1941. It happened to be Good Friday according to the Greek Orthodox calendar. About 5 days later Hitler's army marched into Athens. The ship was packed, and the British Embassy staff carried most of the embassy files with them. One of the passengers was David Balfour, who was the vicar of the little chapel attached to the Evangelismos Hospital, an impressive tall figure of a man sporting a large black beard. Although he had been ordained as a priest of the Greek Orthodox Church, he was a British national, and it was widely rumoured that he was an agent of British intelligence. His official title was Father Demetrios. He was also the spiritual father of the Greek royal family. I refer to David Balfour because recently the Athenian, which is the only English-language magazine in Athens, in its issue dated January 1988, published a feature article about him, saying that even before the Germans had entered Athens he had shaved off his beard and divested himself of his clerical robes. I can say quite categorically that this was not true. When the Corinthia sailed he was still Father Demetrios, and in fact he officiated at a resurrection service while we were still at sea. On the voyage we carried out lifeboat drill on 2 occasions, once when it was thought that there was a U-boat in the vicinity, and another time when an aircraft flew overhead which turned out to be friendly. I shall never forget how I was moved with emotion when I saw the women getting into the boats, most of them carrying babies or children in their arms, calmly singing hymns in low voices. Some time later I met David Balfour again in Cairo, and this time he had shaved off his beard, and he was wearing the uniform of a major in the Intelligence Corps, which is a regular unit of the British Army. Eliaskos said he would like to quote a little more from the sensational article written by J. M. Thursby in the Athenian. Several years before war was even declared, the Abwehr German military intelligence, along with the Nazi civilian secret service, had highly trained undercover agents operating in Greece. With consummate skill, they had catalogued all military and civil information that could be useful to the Third Reich. and organist spy rings throughout the country. As war became more and more inevitable, it also became increasingly imperative that Britain and other anti-fascist countries should gain specific and accurate knowledge of these operations. During this period a monk, who had embraced the Orthodox faith in Warsaw, arrived from Poland via Mount Athos to join the monastery of Pendley, just outside Athens. According to his biographer John Freeman, his registration at Pendley reads: Cell 102, serial number 75, secular name David Balfour, ecclesiastic name Dimitri, place of birth England, age 35, inscribed order of His Holiness the Archbishop of Athens, coming from the Russian Church. Archbishopric Ordinance number 3197 of 9 May 1936. Father Dimitri was obviously a well-educated and very courteous person. He had studied in various parts of Europe and spoke several languages fluently. These included ancient, Byzantine, and modern Greek, not to mention colloquial Manjica slang. When a vacancy arose for a priest to serve the chapel at Evangelismos Hospital in central Athens, who should be more suitable for this post in the heart of the select neighborhood of Kolonaki than the well-educated, well-bred, charming and conscientious Father Dimitri? David Balfour died aged 86 on the 11th of October 1989. Anyway, let me continue my story of the Corinthia trip. Eliascos went on. We celebrated Easter on board, and when we arrived at Alexandria some of us were sent on to Cairo and others went to India. My brother and I presented ourselves at the offices of the press department of the British Embassy in the Garden City. We were received by the well-known Byzantine scholar Stephen Runciman, that is, the Balkans, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Poland, and several others. One of our colleagues was Lawrence Durrell, who later became the famous author of many successful books like the banned Black Book, Bitter Lemons, the Alexandria Quartet, Prospero's Cell, and others. But at that time he used to entertain us daily with a fresh episode about his Aunt Agatha with the wooden leg. Eliascos continued. My brother Patroclus and I were told that we would be attached to the section producing the broadcasts in Greek directed towards occupied Greece, acting as translators, editors, and newsreaders. The head of this section was George Haniotis, the sports editor of the Athens newspaper Eleftherovima, who used to sign his sporting articles Geo. Under him was the well-known literary figure of Dimitri Photiadis, who died in October 1988. When the broadcasts began early in May 1941, I was the principal newsreader. Later, when Haniotis was posted to the Greek embassy in Washington, D.C. as press attaché, my brother was appointed section head. At that time, the prime minister of the Greek government in exile was Emmanuel Tsoudaros, a former director of the Bank of Greece. The foreign language broadcasts from Radio Cairo were under the overall control of the Political Warfare Executive P.W. of the British Ministry of Information. Later, in conjunction with the Americans, the title of the unit was changed to Psychological Warfare Branch. P.W. Every evening we had two broadcasts, at 7:30 and 10:30, which went out on the medium wave transmitter of Radio Cairo at Abu Zabal, run by the E.S.V. Egyptian State Broadcasting. The transmissions in 11 foreign languages were also relayed by 3 short-wave transmitters, 2 belonging to the Telegraph Company cable and wireless Caltions Sub and Su, and an experimental transmitter of 5 kilowatts belonging to a British Army signals unit, with the odd Calzign-Ikik, operated by young Corporal Roly Shears Jite, a radio amateur friend of Norman Joly. The Greek broadcast began in May 1941 and went on to the end of January 1945. During this period many important personalities broadcast from Studio 3, which was also used by well-known war correspondents of the V, V, C, the N, V, C, and many other news organizations. The people of occupied Greece were addressed by Mr. Tsoudaros, Crown Prince Paul of Greece, Sophocles Venizelos, son of the famous Cretan politician Eleftherios Venizelos, who had played a leading role in the political fortunes of modern Greece, and Panaetius Kanellopoulos, minister for war. After the naval mutiny in the port of Alexandria, Admiral Vulgaris spoke to the officers and naval ratings of the Greek Royal Navy. Eliaskos described in detail the negotiations of the Lebanon Conference, which resulted in the appointment of George Papandreou, father of Andreas Papandreou, who was recently prime minister, as the new prime minister of the coalition government in exile. He can be seen at the famous R.C. a velocity microphone type 40 forks, which was used throughout World War I and many years after. This ribbon-type microphone had a very large and heavy permanent magnet embodied in the design and must have weighed about 1.0 times more than a modern electric lapel microphone. I must explain that these wartime broadcasts were carried out in the presence of a switch censor who sat on the other side of the news reader's desk and was able to turn off the microphone in a split second if it ever became necessary. During the 3.5 years of the broadcasts this was done only on one special occasion, and certainly not because the newsreader had gone berserk or something like that. The chief censor was Professor Eric Sloman, who had been the first director of the police academy in Kirkira, Corfu. Then there were censors for the 11 languages used in these broadcasts. The censor for the Polish broadcasts was the Countess Walewska, granddaughter of Napoleon's lady friend. The countess was a rather large lumbering woman. One evening she came in and sat in an armchair on the other side of the studio to wait her turn for the Polish broadcast which followed the Greek. As I was reading the news bulletin I suddenly became conscious of a regular ticking noise in the headphones I was wearing. I made a sign to Mr. Joly, who was acting as switch censor at the time, and he got up and walked over to the countess. He whispered in her ear and asked her what was in her hand-bag. The countess blushed and replied that she had just collected her alarm clock from the watchmaker. I don't know if any sharp-eared listener had heard the ticking and thought that we had a time bomb in the studio. Having mentioned my good friend Mr. Norman Joly, I must record that he was the technical supervisor for the foreign language broadcasts, handling such things as wavelengths for the short-wave relays, training the newsreaders, of whom there must have been over 30, and acting as studio manager and switch censor for some of the languages which he knew. A regular broadcaster in our studio was Francis Noel Baker, who later became a Labour Member of Parliament in the British House of Commons. Like his father, the Noel Baker family are well known in Greece because for several generations they have owned a large property on the island of Euboea in Greek. Francis speaks fluent Greek, and his mother was related to Lord Byron. In recent years he has switched his allegiance to the Conservative Party led by his personal friend Margaret Thatcher. Major Patrick Leigh Fermor, the writer who had kidnapped Major General Heinrich Kripp, came to our studio and described how this audacious operation had been carried out by him and Captain William Stanley Moss, ex-Coldstream Guards, with the considerable assistance of the Cretan resistance movement partisans, purely by coincidence. It was the Greek news bulletin from Cairo which first announced to the world General Montgomery's victory over General Rommel at Alamein. I must explain that during a broadcast the 2 doors leading into the studio were kept closed, and an armed officer of the military police sat outside in civilian clothes to prevent anyone from entering for any reason whatsoever. I was in the middle of reading the news when suddenly, without warning, the inner door opened and a young dispatch rider, still wearing his crash helmet, walked in waving a piece of paper. Mr. Joly immediately switched off the microphone and asked the young man what he thought he was doing. "Most immediate, sir," he said. "This is the Army's highest priority classification, to be broadcast at once." Mr. Joly handed the document to me, and I saw it was written in English. Taking a deep breath, I began translating the text into Greek, with some excitement and trepidation owing to the difference in syntax between the two languages. 46 years later, Mr. Joly gave me the identical sheet of paper, which he had kept as a souvenir. It is printed here in full, at the editorial offices, where they were monitoring the newscast. They thought I had gone out of my mind, because the communiqué had not reached them yet, when they tuned in to the short-wave service of the V.C. They heard the communiqué read out more than an hour after our Greek broadcast. A world scoop, if ever there was one. Years later, when I returned to Athens, many of my friends told me they had heard the first broadcast of the thrilling bulletin, and they could still remember the excitement in my voice. The Greek section was the first to inaugurate the transmission of personal messages. Many people were escaping from occupied Greece in sailing boats across to the shores of Asia Minor, ending up in the Middle East, mostly in Cairo. They had no means of advising their relatives and friends in Greece that they had survived the perilous journey. We used to broadcast pre-arranged messages like "John informs Mary that he has arrived at the village." As I mentioned above, George Papandreou came to our studio and spoke to the people in Greece about the formation of the Government of National Unity, which had been agreed by all parties meeting in the Lebanon, including the representatives of the partisans operating in the mountains of Greece. Papandreou and the government in exile moved to Naples in Italy for a short period, and then returned to Athens on October 12, 1944, for the liberation. Finally, I would like to say that in the dark days before Montgomery's breakthrough at Alamein, when it was quite on the cards that General Rommel might take Cairo, Mr. Joly and I were sent to Jerusalem to make arrangements for the foreign language broadcasts to be continued from there. Fortunately, the situation changed, and we were recalled to Cairo, where we arrived just in time for me to broadcast the historic communiqué announcing the victory at Alamein, which marked the turning point of the war in the Middle East. Chapter 9. Miscellany. 1. The first broadcasting stations of the world. Speech was first transmitted for reception by the general public from Washington, D.C. in 1915, when Europe was still at war. During 1916, the first broadcasting station in the world began regular transmissions from a New York suburb. In 1919, Dr. Frank Conrad, then Assistant Chief Engineer of the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, set up, in his own garage in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, a 75-watt transmitter IX from which he broadcast musical entertainment. This was the first continued scheduled broadcasting in history. The Westinghouse Company realized the potential value of Conrad's work and built HICO, the first regular commercial broadcasting station in the world, which began its career by announcing the results of the Harding-Cox election returns on the November 2, 1920. The first broadcasting station in Europe which began transmitting on November 6, 1919 from The Hague in Holland. Hanso Sturinga Itzerda, a 35-year-old engineer, obtained the first license granted in Europe for the transmission of music and speech for general reception, as opposed to the wireless telegraphy stations which had been operating point-to-point services. From the end of 1919 to 1924, this station transmitted a series of musical programs 3 times a week called The Hague Concerts. The original wavelength of 670 meters was later changed to 150 meters. At that time, most of the people who heard these concerts would have been using headphones, and they would not have been very critical about the quality of the sounds they were hearing compared to the magical novelty of snatching voices and music apparently out of thin air. This historic transmitter can be seen in the Museum of the Dutch Postal Services in The Hague. The first transmissions of speech and music in England were made from Chelmsford, Essex, when a 15 transmitter of the Marconi Company began regular transmissions in February of 1920. In the summer of 1924 the world's greatest radio companies, British Marconi, German Telefunken, French Radio Telegraphy, and American R.C. I met in London to discuss transatlantic. The learned gentlemen all agreed that the Atlantic could only be spanned by ultra-long waves of 10 to 20 meters, which would require the use of hundreds of kilowatts of power and receivers as large as a trunk, not to speak of antennas more than a mile long. Dr. Frank Conrad, who was also present at the conference, had brought with him a small short-wave receiver less than a foot square. When he connected it to a curtain rod as an antenna, the faint but clear voices of his assistants in the U.S. were heard from nearly 4,000 miles away. With this spectacular demonstration, he administered the death blow to all plans for high-power, ultra-long wavelength transmitters. And from then on the commercial companies concentrated their efforts on developing equipment for international communications on the short waves, with present-day electronic news gathering and worldwide satellite links. The problems faced by broadcasting organizations 50 years ago when transmitting programs which did not originate in a studio were thought to be very complex. In the Handbook for 1928, there was an article entitled Outside Broadcast Problems, which said, "Work outside the studio is often the most difficult that the broadcast engineer can be asked to undertake, not so much from a technical as from a practical point of view. Very often he has to take his apparatus to some place he has never seen before, set up his amplifiers in most awkward positions, test his lines to the studio, decide on his microphone placings, and run out the wiring in the space of an hour or so, with little previous experience to guide him. It is in fairly echoey halls, theaters, and churches that the majority of outside broadcasts take place. For example, a sermon preached in a church would be intelligible probably to the whole of the congregation, but to render it intelligibly on a loudspeaker, the microphone would have to be, say, not more than 10 feet from the speaker. In broadcasting a play from a theater, when the speakers are moving about, the only way of dealing with the problem is to use several microphones and a mixing device which enables the engineer to change silently from one microphone to another, or to combine them in varying proportions. Some rapid switching may sometimes be necessary. Even with good microphones and amplifiers, the engineer in the field may often experience difficulties with the lines connecting the outside point to the studio. The majority of such lines do not transmit the higher frequencies adequately, especially the longer ones. The problems become immense when European simultaneous broadcasts are attempted. Experiments on the continental wireless link have done no more than reveal its unreliability. The undersea telephone line, however, does not give either good or even intelligible quality of speech if it is longer than a couple of hundred miles, and it is quite unusable for the transmission of a musical program. The has been the first in the world to exploit simultaneous broadcasting to its fullest advantage for a national system, and thanks to the cooperation of the post office engineers, it is possible to pick up a program wherever it may take place within the British Isles and radiate it simultaneously from all distribution centers. looking ahead still further and assuming that the wireless will supplement the wireline link. There is no reason why a simultaneous broadcast of something of fundamental importance to the whole civilized world should not take place sometime in the future. In a book entitled Radio Goes to War, published by Faber and Faber in 1943, Charles J. Rollo wrote, "Radio went to war on 5 continents shortly after the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. In 9 years it has been streamlined from a crude propaganda bludgeon into the most powerful single instrument of political warfare the world has ever known. Spreading with the speed of light, it carries the human voice 7 times round the globe in 1 second. When Hitler makes a speech in the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, listeners in America and the whole world hear his words by short wave even before his own immediate audience hears them. Radio speaks in all tongues to all classes. All pervasive, it penetrates beyond national frontiers, spans the walls of censorship that bar the way to the written word, and seeps through the fine net of the Gestapo. It reaches the illiterate and the informed, the young and the old, the civilian and the soldier in the front line, the policy makers and the inarticulate masses. So great is the importance of radio today that the seizure of a defeated nation's transmitters has become one of the primary spoils of war. In Greece, broadcasting was started in the northern city of Thessaloniki Salonika by the pioneer of Balkan broadcasting Christos Tsingeridis in 1928. A museum in that city tells the full story of the first broadcasting station in the whole of the Balkans. Broadcasting in the capital, Athens, started on March 25, 1938, when a second-hand 15-telefunken transmitter was put into operation in the suburb of Lyosha. The center-fed T antenna was supported between 2 pylons of 85 meters (279 feet). In 1944, when the German army was pulling out of Athens, they tried to blow the pylons up, but one of them remained standing at a crazy angle, because one of the explosive charges had been placed incorrectly. 2. Avlis, the voice of Hellas. The 5th program of the Greek broadcasting service Elliniki Radiophonia is transmitted from the shortwave transmitting center at Avlis, about 70 kilometers north of Athens. The station was put into service in 1972 and has 2 100 Marconi shortwave transmitters and a veritable forest of antennas covering 100 acres, arranged in 3 lines to cover the desired directions, as can be seen on the Great Circle map. The pylons supporting the 6 arrays are truly impressive at 328 feet. Each line has 8 separate antennas for the 6, 7, 9, 11, 15, 17, and 21 broadcasting bands. Each antenna consists of 2 curtains with a total of 8 horizontal dipoles. The dipoles are all fed by open wire feeders, which can be remotely switched to enable radiation in 2 directions 180 degrees apart. There are also 3 curtains for the 11-meter band 26 which may be put into service during sunspot cycle 22 if the M.U.F. allows it, for transmissions to neighboring countries like Cyprus, Turkey, the Balkans, and the countries of the Middle East. There are 2 rotatable log periodic antennas with a high angle of vertical radiation 45 degrees and a wide angle of 32 degrees in the horizontal plane. The remotely controlled switching center allows each of the 2 transmitters to be connected to any one of the 23 antennas. Electromechanical protection circuits ensure that a transmitter can only be connected to an antenna that is tuned to the same frequency. The change of antennas and transmitting frequencies is made during the 10-minute interval between programs, which always begin on the hour, preceded by the now familiar signature tune of a shepherd playing his flute with the tinkling of sheep bells in the background, recorded in 1936, followed by the Greek national anthem. The special programs of news and features originate in the broadcasting headquarters in Athens and go on the air throughout the 24 hours of the day in Greek, English, and many foreign languages. Reports of reception are welcome and should be addressed to K. V. A. Avlis, Greece. The Greek initials stand for Shortwave Transmitting Center, but Avlis was in the news long before the Greek Broadcasting Service decided to install its shortwave transmitters there. In ancient times a great fleet of ships had been assembled in the harbor there, ready to set sail for Troy, following the abduction of the beautiful Helen of Sparta by Paris, the young prince of Troy. But there had been no wind for many weeks, and the sea was dead calm. Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, who had himself contributed over 100 ships to the fleet, decided to consult his seer, as was the custom. The seer slaughtered a young lamb and scrutinized its entrails. He then announced that the wind would come up if Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia on the altar of sacrifice. King Agamemnon dispatched a messenger to Mycenae for Peter being available in those days. The king said he was planning to marry her off to Achilles, the most eligible bachelor of the day. When poor Iphigenia arrived, she was quickly placed on the sacrificial altar, and had her pretty throat slit. However, there seems to be another version to the end of the story. Just before the human sacrifice was due to be made, Artemis Diana, the famous goddess of hunting, sent a small deer, which was placed on the altar instead of the girl. Iphigenia was secretly spirited away to Taurida, in northern Greece, and put in charge of Diana's temple there. This story is the subject of a well-known classical Greek play. Historical note on the Marconi still steel tape recording machine. At the beginning of the century, Professor Paulsen, one of radio's earliest pioneers, discovered that a magnetic impression could be made on a moving length of wire which remained on the wire even after it had been rolled up. He used his machine to record the Morse code only, that is, magnetism on and off. In 1924, Dr. Still in Germany made a machine which could record sounds. C sent two engineers to Berlin, and after a demonstration they offered to buy the machine. But in the end they returned to England empty-handed. In 1931, Mr. Louis Blattner managed to buy a machine and bring it to England. He called it the Blattner phone. By this time Dr. Still had replaced Paulsen's wire with a flat steel tape 6 m wide. Each reel of tape could only accommodate 20 minutes of recording. There was a constant and heavy background hiss, due to the inherent quality of the steel tape itself. Still Inventions Limited joined forces with Martinus Wireless Telegraph Company Limited to produce, with the close co-operation of the C Research Department. The Marconi still machine, which was put into use in 1934. The tape width was reduced to 3 and the thickness to only 0.8 of a millimeter, in order to secure the reproduction of the higher audio frequencies. It was found necessary to run the tape at a rate of 90 meters per minute past the recording and reproducing heads. This meant that the length of tape required for a half-hour's program was nearly 3 kilometers. 4. Brief description of the ribbon or velocity microphone. George Papandreou, Greek Prime Minister of the wartime government of national unity in exile, is seen with the famous ribbon microphone developed by the C in 1934. This microphone RCA designation 44 consists of a ribbon of corrugated aluminium foil only 0.2 of an inch thick suspended vertically in a very intense but narrow magnetic field. When sounds vibrate the ribbon, extremely low alternating voltages are developed at the ends of the ribbon, which has a very low impedance of only 0.15 ohm, necessitating the use of a step-up transformer of 1:45 turns ratio very close to it. The frequency response is 20 to 16. 0 is. A drawback is that the ribbon can be blown out of the magnetic, so the casing is lined with several layers of chiffon which let in the sounds but not the air. Without its base, the ribbon microphone weighs 4 kilograms, nearly 9 pounds. 5. An outstanding antenna system designed by Rex Forju for phase-E amateur satellite communication. The uplink section comprises 4 88-element JBOM multi-beams which provide a power gain of 225. The 2 downlink 8-element YAGIS are each fitted with a small DC motor directly coupled to a 9-inch length of 5 brass studding rotating inside a block of linked to a push rod which can move the antennas 75 degrees both sides of the vertical position, either in unison or in opposite directions. This system provides infinitely variable polarization which optimizes the downlink signal at any instant. 6. The saga of H.M.S. Adrias. While fighting in the area of the Dodekins Islands on the night of the 22nd October 1943, the destroyer Adrias 67 was seriously damaged by a mine but refused to sink. Under the command of Commander John Towmbas, the ship covered a distance of approximately 700 nautical miles, reaching the port of Alexandria in Egypt on the eve of the feast of St. Nicholas, the patron saint of all seamen. The Greek minister of the navy Sophocles Venizelos, and the British admiral in command of the Royal Navy in the eastern Mediterranean, provided an honorary escort for the brave little ship. A few months later the snub-nosed 67 joined the fleet of 100 vessels of all sorts which sailed to Greece for the liberation. The photographs were taken by the author with the exception of the damaged 67 who travelled back to Greece on H.M.S. Averof in the same convoy. The photograph of Lady 4, a similar type destroyer to Adrias, shows how much of her bows was blown off by the collision with the mine. H.M.S. stands for His Hellenic Majesty's ship. 7. German sabotage at the cable and wireless station at Palani, Greece, in World War I. As the German army was pulling out of Greece in October 1944, its engineers carried out extensive sabotage to installations of a strategic value. At Palani, not far from Athens, an attempt was made to destroy the transmitter hall by dropping one of the antenna towers onto it, but the equipment was not damaged. They were more successful at the Royal Navy transmitting site at Votonikos. Here they tried to destroy 6 300-foot tubular masts. One remained standing and also the lower part of another. All the test gear in the lab was thrown out of a second-floor window and burnt. I was acting as official photographer for my unit at the time. When I walked into a small storeroom, I saw all the equipment had been thrown off the shelves onto the floor, but appeared to be intact. I spotted a box of brand new packed German Navy Morse keys and decided the time had come for me to acquire a small war trophy of my own. As I bent down to pick up a key, I was horrified to see 2 large sticks of gelignite perched perilously on the edge of a shelf. The explosive was tied with white ribbon, with a weight attached to the other end. I froze to the spot. Gingerly I lifted my trophy out of the box and began to walk slowly backwards, being very careful not to knock anything over. I breathed a sigh of relief when I was out of the room and immediately alerted the engineers who came and defused the booby trap. So this book might never have been written thanks to the German army. At the Athens Broadcasting Station transmitter site at Lyosha, my unit erected a small temporary T antenna which allowed the station to come on the air again. But a short time later, when the Elas Guerrillas overran the area. They began using the transmitter to broadcast their own view of events. We provided the Broadcasting Authority with a 610 mobile transmitter installed next to the Parliament building in the center of town, using the same frequency of 610. Listeners in Cairo can't understand what was going on when one moment they heard an official government announcement and a little later a war communique issued by the communist guerrillas. 8. Over the horizon or ionospheric radar. Author as mentioned briefly in Chapter 1. It was in April 1976 that the then Soviet Union first unleashed a diabolical noise on the bands which caused widespread interference to all broadcasting and telecommunication services between 6 and 20s. On the first day, the knock 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 went on continuously for over 10 hours. Radio amateurs, who were among the services that suffered from the interference, soon came to call this noise the woodpecker. By rotating their beams when tuned to the 14's band, they established that the transmissions appeared to originate from the vicinity of the town of Gomel in the U.S. The governments of many countries worldwide immediately protested to Moscow, and all they got in reply was a brief statement that the USSR was carrying out an experiment. The reason for the very strong on-off pulses was probably because, at first, the Russians were using existing radar antennas which permit the transmitting and receiving functions to share the same antenna. Modern author installations have different transmitting and receiving sites, often located many miles apart. From the early 1950s, pulsed oblique ionosphere sounders had shown that the normal ionosphere is much more stable than had previously been thought to be. The physical reason for this is that the incredibly tenuous ionized gas which does the reflecting has a molasses-like viscosity. Of course, there are daily and seasonal changes, but over limited periods of half an hour or so, the F layer at a given location is actually quite well behaved. It bounces back signals in a nearly constant direction and with nearly constant amplitude, just what is required for good radar performance. Over the horizon radars use the ionosphere as a kind of mirror to see around the curvature of the Earth. They have a variety of uses, both military and civilian, and they have the advantage over line-of-sight microwave radars of being able to cover enormous areas with much less power and at a fraction of the cost of the latter. A relocatable author system can track aircraft targets right down to ground level. In an early experiment, operators were puzzled by the sudden disappearance from their screen of an aircraft they had been tracking as it taxied along the ground. They found out later that the reason for the disappearance was that the aircraft had gone into a metal hangar which did not show on the screen because it was not in motion, as explained below. In 1979, the United States Air Force began experimenting with an author system at a site near Bangor, Maine. Because frequencies were being used, the power was kept very low to minimize interference to other services during the early tests. At the time of writing 1989, it is believed that a full-power relocatable author system situated in Virginia is being used in the anti-drug war. As can be seen from the map, this author can cover a vast area, 1.6 million nautical miles, straddling the whole Caribbean. The scan area stretches from the coast of Colombia in South America up through Nicaragua and Honduras to Florida on its west boundary, and then southwards through Puerto Rico to Trinidad and Tobago and the northern coast of Venezuela. But this vast area is not covered continuously. The system operator can provide surveillance in a number of sectors known as DIRS dwell information regions. Each one of the 176 DIRS can be illuminated for only a few seconds at a time. Small aircraft and small vessels can be detected by an ingenious method only when they move. This is how it is done. At the receiving site of the Rother system, a very large antenna stretches out over a distance of 8 400 feet. It consists of 372 dual monopole vertical elements, each 19 feet high, backed by a huge reflector screen which makes the antenna substantially unidirectional. Each pair of vertical elements has its own receiver which digitize the incoming signals. All the digitized signals are then fed through a fiber optic link to a master signal processor. The main receiver can be programmed to pass on returns from one particular region while eliminating most of the other returns as unwanted noise or clutter. But because the wanted target is moving, while the clutter is not, a filtering system based on the Doppler shift principle, even when the echo is only 1 or 2 Hz different, will lock onto it and track it as long as it stays in motion. Furthermore, the Rother system has its own built-in automatic management and assessment function and does not have to depend on external sounding data. It measures the ionosphere height continuously and instantly selects the most appropriate frequency to use to scan the target area, ideally in one hop. This automatic function uses a quasi-vertical incidence sounder key to measure the height of the ionosphere near the transmitting and receiving sites, which, as mentioned earlier, can be miles apart, and a radar backscatter sounder to measure the height of the ionosphere downrange 500 to 800 nautical miles away. The incoming real-time data from these soundings are compared with data stored in computer memory. Once real-time data are matched to a model of the ionosphere, the model can be used to operate the system for the best results. Based on the prevailing propagation conditions, the data for the ionospheric models take up more than 200 megabytes of computer storage space. Operators thus know when and where to expect degraded performance. Of course, strong solar activity can virtually make over-the-horizon radar unusable. A spectrum analyzer display shows all the frequencies between 5 and 28 Ms in order to avoid possible interference to other services. Those frequencies which are known to be permanently allocated to fixed broadcasting and telecommunication stations are locked out, as well as frequencies which happen to be used at any instant so that they can also be avoided by the author transmitter. Glossary for non-technical readers. A mode of modulation amplitude. R L. Amateur radio relay League. S. Beacon transmitter radiating identification signal. C. Q. General call to any station. C. R. T. Cathode ray tube like television screen. C. W. Continuous wave mode of sending telegraphy. Calzing station identification letters and numbers. Corer device for making radio frequencies audible. De Morse abbreviation for from French. Communication over a long distance. Detector any device for making radio frequencies audible. Doppler shift change in pitch of sound or frequency of a radio wave. D. E. S. Initials of a wartime Greek guerrilla organization. ER. Equivalent Greek initials for R. G. Q. V. E. L. S. Initials of a wartime Greek guerrilla organization. EL. F. Extremely low frequency. EM. E. Earth Moon Earth. Also moon bounce Q. VH. H. M. S. His Hellenic Majestus ship. Gasket, a type of transistor. Kilohertz. International unit for kilosical. M. U. F. Maximum usable frequency. Megahertz. International unit for megasicle. Moon bounce communication by reflection from the moon. Author over the horizon radar. Q-code abbreviations used when communicating by telegraphy. Cone unreadable. TWO barely readable. Only some words. 3 readable with considerable difficulty. 4 readable with practically no difficulty. 5 perfectly readable. Crow high power. Crook low power. Kurt stop sending. frequently used for shut up. So two-way communication. Call to all stations. Also title of Journal of the R. R. L. Location or address of a station. R. G. Radio Amateur Association of Greece. R. F. Radio Frequency. R. S. G. V. Radio Society of Great Britain. Or system of reporting readability. Strength and tone of a signal. ARCS receiver. Unit for reporting strength of received signal. SI unit international system of definitions. Single side band. A mode of modulation. SOL room where radio equipment is set up. Shack room where radio equipment is set up. Silent key deceased radio amateur. Sporadic E. Propagation via the E layer of the ionosphere. T. E. P. Transequatorial propagation. Transmitter. Troposcatter propagation via the troposphere. U. H. F. Ultra high frequency. VH. F. Very high frequency. W. C. Worked contacted all continents. Still wife of a radio amateur. Young lady operator. 73 Morse abbreviation for best regards. Yagi, a type of antenna designed by a Japanese of that name.